Both of them went the same.
Good evening.
So one went the 7th grade.
Welcome to the Zoning Board of Appeals meeting for March 1st. Tonight's discussion will be the Abbeville Preserve and Abbeville Commons. This meeting is being audio and video recorded in accordance with Massachusetts ethics laws. This evening, first, our applicant Tom DePlacido and John Smolik are going to make a statement, and then we're going to go right into the Horsley and Witten review by Neil Price. John.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, other members of the board. John Smolak, attorney for the applicants. This evening, I think the lion's share of the hearing is going to be devoted to hydrogeology. And we've handed out a proposed draft agenda to get through as much as we can this evening. Hopefully we can get through all of it. But just to introduce you to members of the project team, most of our project team members are here this evening, including Thomas DePlacido, the applicant's manager, Stephen Smith of GeoHydrocycle, our project hydrogeologist, Carlos Quintal of CAQ Associates, our project wastewater treatment engineering consultant, Rick Goudreau, our project civil engineer, as well as Matt Merver, our landscape architect from Boiler Engineering, and Henry Honorato of HPA Design will be here shortly. So since we have a lot to cover, I wanted to just, unless Tom has further comments, we want to get right through the main topic of discussion, and I understand it'll be through the applicant's peer review engineer that'll start the discussion.
Neil Price. Neil is from Horsley Witten. He did the peer review for the ZBA board. Neil.
Hello. Good. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out, members of the board. Can everyone hear me okay? As you know, the town hired Horsley Witten to peer review certain aspects of the Abbeville proposed development related to hydrogeology. I'm senior hydrogeologist with the Horsley Witten Group, headquartered out of Sandwich. The three topics that fell under the purview of hydrogeology were wastewater, the grading plan, how material is going to be moved about the site, and the downgradient AUL site. And AUL stands for activity and use limitation. It's essentially a step in the Massachusetts laws for how contaminated sites are handled. So when it's all settled and the dust is cleared, it becomes an AUL. Do you, I guess? Yeah. Okay, great. So we focused on sensitive receptors with regards to the wastewater treatment plant, potential sensitive receptors that might receive effluent from the plant. And as you see, the plant is here with the two disposal beds highlighted. Next, please. The first sensitive receptor is the private wells along Lawrence Street. The second sensitive receptor are the town test wells. This is a potential new drinking water site that has not yet been developed but has had some initial testing done on it. And then the third sensitive receptor is the AUL area that I mentioned. So a little more detail on that right at the get-go. So this is highlighted in this red here, and it consists of two parts. One, a series of settling lagoons where material from the former mill was, the water was sent down and settled out in those ponds. And the other is a capped landfill area where contaminated material from the whole site was piled up and covered over with a cap I believe, in the 90s. Next. And the last sensitive receptor that we looked at was the Mill River itself, because the Mill River will be the ultimate receiving water for effluent that is discharged from the treatment plant. So when looking at all of these receptors, the first thing we look at is how the groundwater flow paths originate or move. So this figure shows an overlay of two different groundwater maps. And these brown lines are the contours created by the applicant in their submittal to DEP for their application for this wastewater treatment facility. And the blue lines are contours I created using a different set of wells than those that were used by the applicant. And the point for doing this was I had noted in my letter, for those of you that read it, was that these contours were based on simply the 3 wells highlighted right there that had water in them at the time that the applicant was doing this work. I went back to a different set of time where there were water level data from a wider variety of wells and used water levels that the applicant surveyed in the river to come up with these blue contours. So before we go too much further with this, let me explain, for the help of people that may not know, these contours, groundwater contours, depict the elevation of the water table surface below the ground. It's just like the topographic contours on the ground, except it's for groundwater under the ground. So if this were a hill, this was a top of a hill, this would be the high point, and the hill would go down to the base. And if you dropped the ball at the top of the hill, it would roll downhill perpendicular to the contours until it reached the base of the hill. Same thing's true with groundwater. Groundwater always flows from the high points to the low points, and it flows perpendicular to the contour lines. So the biggest thing that you can see here is that in general, both the contours I created and the contours the applicant created are similar and show groundwater flow to the northeast, heading ultimately towards the Mill River, which is logical and sensible. Rivers are generally the discharge locations for groundwater flow. There's a little bit of difference. I used a different time of water levels, so you can see they're quite a bit higher. I can't read exactly from here, but it looks like they may be 6 or 8 feet higher from the time frame that the applicant, very well, thank you, Bambi. Yeah, about 8 feet higher at the time, and these were from 2015 was in spring of 2015, these blue contour lines, and this past fall of 2017 were the brown contour lines. So there's one difference, that the water was a little higher in 2015 than it was in 2017. And you see you get a little bit more nuanced idea of how the flow goes with the larger expression of the blue lines than the brown lines. But in general, they show the same flow direction. This figure, can you zoom a little bit on that too, please? This figure was created by the applicant. So this shows what is called the Mounded seasonal high groundwater level. So what this is, it's 3 things. It's the regular water table that we talked about on the last slide, and then it's the seasonal high. So it's been adjusted upwards because we recall, their measurements were taken in fall when the water levels were low. So there's a methodology that can be used to raise those levels up to what we would expect to be a high water level typical of high spring season. So that's step 1. And then step 2 is they also did an analysis to account for the impacts of all of the wastewater effluent that's going to be loaded to the ground. Adding that extra wastewater effluent makes the groundwater rise up higher still. So this map that the applicant made is the sum total of all those 3 factors put together. So this would be an idea of what the water table would look like under operational conditions of the wastewater treatment plant in the high groundwater season in springtime. And this shows, again, a generally very similar pattern to what I showed on the last slide, with flow heading off to the northeast towards the Mill River. And this bending here, this bowing of the contours, is indicating that mound. So the water is higher directly under the facility where that extra effluent's being added to the ground. Next. So with regard to the private wells along Lawrence Street, one of the important criteria to look at is the bedrock topography. So this is yet another contour map, but in this case we're looking at the elevation of the bedrock surface below the sediments that are lying on top of that. And what this is showing is a fairly steep wall or slope of bedrock rising from the wastewater treatment site in the direction of Lawrence Street. So all of these private wells on Lawrence Street are bedrock wells. So what that means is the wells are gathering their water from the bedrock aquifer underneath the superficial sediments as opposed to from the superficial sediments themselves. And of course the treatment plant is discharging to the superficial sediments. So the shape of this bedrock valley is one of the factors that created the northeast flow direction that we showed in those slides, because as you can see, it would be difficult for water to come too far in this direction when it's butting up against a bedrock sloping surface. Next. Here's a better depiction, a cartoonish depiction of that situation. So imagine you're standing down at the Mill River looking upslope towards the wastewater treatment facility. This is a cross-section you would see. So here's the bedrock. Lawrence Street would be over here. Here's the superficial sediments in the valley where that wastewater treatment facility would be located. All these blue lines are cracks in the bedrock. So in a regular sand and gravel aquifer like here, the water is contained in between the pore spaces of the individual sand and clay and gravel particles. In bedrock, you don't have that, so the water is only contained in the fractures. So anywhere where the rock is cracked and broken, there's water in there. Obviously, there's a lot less water in cracked bedrock than there would be in a permeable sand and gravel aquifer. So that's why these bedrock wells have to be so deep. And if you go to the next slide, I think. So the bedrock wells go really deep, and in our situation, I think, yeah, they're all several hundred feet deep. And the idea is you try to intersect as many of these cracks as possible so that you can get a reliable supply of water into the well. So how does the water get into these cracks? Well, it can only get into the cracks by where the cracks originate at the ground surface. So it rains on the land surface, percolates through that sand and gravel, and can get into the cracks in the rock at the places where those cracks intersect the sand and gravel aquifer. So what that means is the water that ultimately gets in these wells can be coming from far afield, close by, and a fairly unpredictable set of directions depending on which fractures it intersects and what orientation those fractures go in 3 dimensions. Can you go back one? Let's see. No, forward one more. Okay, I'm actually good. Just wanted to make sure. So with regard to how this affects those private wells on Lawrence Street, there's a few things that are important. So the conductivity, and by conductivity I essentially mean how readily the aquifer can transmit water, is much higher for a sand and gravel aquifer than it is for a fractured bedrock aquifer. So that means as the water is infiltrated at the treatment site, it much more readily wants to travel in that aquifer than try to get into the bedrock aquifer. And also, as I mentioned, the intersection of those bedrock cracks with the superficial aquifer is down at the bottom of the superficial aquifer, obviously. So the effluent here, in order to get into those bedrock cracks, would need to sink all the way through the aquifer to get down to that level. And what really is happening is as this wastewater treatment effluent goes into the groundwater, it's traveling in this direction at the same time it's sinking. So it's not likely to actually reach the bottom of the aquifer until somewhere down here, if at all, before it rises to get into the Mill River. All in all, when you combine the fact that the flow direction skirts the wells, that the wells are in a deep bedrock aquifer as opposed to the same superficial aquifer that the treatment plant is in, and the fact that the effluent is traveling preferably in this direction in the superficial aquifer, it makes it unlikely for there to be significant contribution from the treatment facility to the bedrock wells. Not impossible, but not likely and not significant. Next. So, because it's not impossible, we recommended in our comment letter that the applicant use high-level treatment for the wastewater treatment facility, that the highest level that the state requires for treatment facilities that are within 2 years' time of travel of a public drinking water supply well. So that affords some protection because the water coming out of the treatment plant is of very high quality to begin with. It'll be diluted by other rain going on, and then the fact that, as I just finished mentioning, the likelihood of any of that water getting into those bedrock cracks to the wells is fairly low. In addition, we also recommended monitoring be conducted for monitoring wells in between the treatment facility and the private wells, and perhaps of the private wells themselves for those residents that are willing and interested to do that, in order to provide protection so that we would be able to tell before anything got into the wells if there was something happening. Next. These conditions were agreed to by the applicant. Next. So moving on to the next sensitive receptor, which is the town test wells, the test well site for the potential new drinking water source. In this situation, and if you look down on this map on the corner, this is that bedrock contour map we talked about before, showing the high sloping wall towards Lawrence Street. We don't have that clear cut of a protective barrier in this direction. So the possibility of effluent heading from here in that direction is higher than it would be to head from here towards the private well. So we're a little more concerned about that, along with the fact that were this developed as a real public water supply, the influence of a big public pumping well draws groundwater into it. So it would be an attractive source. So the tendency is there to create a path for effluent to go from here to there. So for these reasons, we deem this site to be more likely to get some influence from the treatment facility than were the private wells. Next, please, Amy. The recommendations are essentially the same, and they serve both purposes. So again, treat the effluent to the highest standards that are required by the state for being within this 2-year time of travel to a public supply well, and conduct additional pre- and post-construction monitoring of wells in between the treatment plant and the town test well site. Next, Amy, please. And these also were agreed to by the applicant. The Mill River. This is a little complicated. I'll try not to bore you too much on this because there's a lot of acronyms in here. But the point of this is that there is a TMDL, and TMDL stands for Total Maximum Daily Load. So this is another pollutant contamination term where we've calculated how much of a given pollutant a given water body can receive on a daily basis and still meet its required, health and safety factors and so forth. So for the Mill River, there is a TMDL for the nutrient phosphorus. Phosphorus is one of the 3 main nutrients in lots of things. Wastewater is one of them, stormwater is another, just decay of leaf litter, animal, pet and wildlife droppings. There's all sorts of atmospheric deposition. There's all sorts of sources for phosphorus. But in any case, this TMDL requires a 50% overall reduction and a 60% reduction in the wastewater load to the Mill River, to the Upper Charles River, really, which the Mill River is a contributory source of, based from 2005, which was the time that the data that informed this TMDL study. Now, it gets complicated because this TMDL has not really been implemented. The stormwater component of it will be regulated under what's called the MS4 permit, and that stands for Municipal Separate Storm Sewer, 4 S's, MS4. So this is a stormwater regulation that would be enforced by the EPA. It's been in the works and pending for the better part of a decade, held up by lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. It's currently scheduled to come online this summer. Who knows if it will actually come online or not. The wastewater component is controlled by Mass DEP and how they license wastewater plants. To my knowledge to date, DEP has not enforced this TMDL for groundwater treatment facilities like this one. So we don't know for sure if or how the TMDL will be relevant to this, but there is the chance that we're concerned about for the town's sake, because the town will ultimately be held responsible for meeting this TMDL. So adding any new load, if it becomes enforced on both fronts, the stormwater and the wastewater, would be something the town would have to make up for through mitigation at some later date. Next, please, Amy. So in order to sort of help address that in some way possible, we recommended that the applicant do whatever could be done practically within this development to help give the town a little bit of a head start on mitigation towards meeting this phosphorus TMDL. And that included 3 things. 1, maximize the unsaturated thickness beneath the wastewater treatment facility infiltration beds. And the reason for this is because phosphorus tends to bind to the sediment particles. So the more sediment that you can put in the path between the discharge location and the river, the more phosphorus gets bound up and the less of it can get to the river. Second, provide as high a level phosphorus treatment at the facility as is reasonably possible. For the obvious reason, the less you put in, the more will ultimately get to the river. And third, provide some capacity for future expansion of that treatment facility to tie in existing nearby homes. The reason for that is the treatment plant will do a far better job of treating phosphorus than will individual septic systems. So if you do the math and add in existing phosphorus loads and treat it to a higher level, you can end up at a net reduction overall from what the watershed gives to the river. Next, Amy. And these things were all agreed to by the applicant. Next. The AUL site. So again, this is a former contamination site from the former mill activities. And as I explained, it consists of 2 parts, the lagoons and this landfill area. And we were concerned, would the rise in the water table created by this wastewater treatment facility somehow accelerate or migrate or accelerate the migration of contaminants away from the AUL site towards the river? The applicant's model of groundwater rise at the site showed a 0.4-foot rise of water table at the AUL site. So the question was, is that significant? And the answer is not, it doesn't look like it is, for a couple of reasons. First, the lagoon component are already in groundwater. So it doesn't matter if you put a little bit more water in them or not, they're already getting groundwater influence, and whatever that's doing will keep doing. And the second is for the landfill area. The applicant went and reviewed all of the official documents on this, and they did some field survey, and they created this graphic, which is again a cross-section. So this is the land surface up here, and you're looking down below the ground. So what's called bottom of consolidation area is the bottom of the landfill, and the top of sand is the ground surface. So the landfill materials are occurring right here, and the 100-year flood elevation is below that. Seasonal high groundwater and the mounded groundwater from the site will be below that still. So this is showing, based on the available data that we have, that it's unlikely that there'll be extra groundwater getting into this AUL site and potentially causing a risk of migration of contaminants. Next. The other important thing here is that the AUL site is located, the landfill part of it, is located between what we're calling the Tailrace and the actual river. And again, this Tailrace is a spot where when the mill was operating, they were taking water from the dammed pond and running it to run the mill. It's still got water in it. It still collects groundwater and sends it off to the river. So the hydraulic influence of the river and the Tailrace limit the amount to which the water table can rise, because if you picture the water table rising, when it hits either the river or this Tailrace, it can just quickly speed away and head on downstream. So it doesn't tend to rise as far as it would in some place that was far away from a surface water, river, or stream. So that influence tends to limit how high the groundwater could rise here. And lastly, this whole AUL situation is controlled by DEP. The applicant of this development is the landowner and the responsible party for DEP. So, we essentially recommend to let Mass DEP decide if they have any issues with this or not, and if they do, they will take it up with the landowner as their proper due diligence. Next, Amy. The next thing we looked at was site grading. Were there any things of concern with how the site was due to be graded with hydrogeology? And the first thing that's not on this slide, but there are 3 stormwater infiltration basins here. that are handling essentially all of the stormwater from the site. When I looked at those are the only places that do not maintain 10 feet of separation from the proposed grade and groundwater. And the town bylaw says that you have to maintain 10 feet of separation between your excavation and the groundwater, with certain exceptions. And one of those exceptions is utilities. Now, stormwater, by definition, if you want to capture it by gravity, it's the places that you capture it have to be low. So, to my mind, this is a reasonable exemption to that town bylaw for excavation, but it's something that the town will have to consider if they think that that's a reasonable exemption. The other thing with these infiltration basins is the separation between seasonal high groundwater. And you may recall me at the beginning talking a little bit about this seasonal high groundwater adjustment, which essentially is taking your observed water level and raising it up to mimic what would be expected during the highest spring groundwater period. So state rules require you to maintain 4 feet of separation beneath each of these infiltration areas, or if you don't have 4, if you have more than 2 but less than 4, you can do some further analyses to try to prove things out. So we looked at those. The applicant had originally based their groundwater readings on readings taken in 2015 and showed a 5-foot separation from groundwater for those. We went and did what's called a Frimpter adjustment. So this is named after a former USGS scientist named Mike Frimpter, who's retired. And he developed this technique I've been talking about with the seasonal high groundwater. It's essentially a mathematical correlation between your site and a set of index wells with long-term records. And you do this math, and that's how you do this adjustment. People call it the Frimpter adjustment, as named after the guy that invented it. So we did that and came up with these numbers, which are higher, so it gives you a higher groundwater elevation than the applicant originally had, and did not get the 4 feet of required separation. After this was in the letter that I wrote in early February. After that, the applicant went back out to the site a week ago and measured water levels again and found them slightly higher even than these Frimpter adjusted values that I had done. So water is higher now than it was in 2015, and even higher than the seasonal high groundwater adjustment would have expected you to have. So as a result of that, the applicant has agreed to go back and look at this again and make sure that they provide a minimum of 4 feet of separation. And they're going to do that from one of two ways. They're going to go back, this is good, this is fine, yeah. They're going to go back and dig more test pits. And the reason for that is the primary way that you identify seasonal high groundwater is by digging a test pit and looking for coloring in the soil that indicates the highest level that the groundwater has reached. Essentially, it rusts the sand, right? So you can see a red staining that marks the high water level in the test pit. The old test pits didn't show any evidence of this, but they're going to go back and look again, see if they can find evidence for this soil modeling. If they find it, then they'll use that, provided it's no lower than the readings from last week. If they don't, they'll use the Frimpter values based on last week's data, and in all circumstances get that 4 feet of separation. The next thing with site grading, and this is not a hydrogeology issue at all, but I know it's of interest to a lot of people, is the steep slope off of the back of Lawrence Street, which is approximately a 40-foot vertical drop at a 2-to-1 slope. And the cut for that slope becomes very close to the property line for number 51 Lawrence Street. So this is sort of the most critical area for looking at that. Next, please. The issue with the steep slope is at 2-to-1, they can't really be reliably mowed. So you need to plant them with something other than grass that will establish itself and prevent erosion. And also it needs to take root pretty quickly so that you don't get rainwater erosion while it's trying to establish. So we recommended that they do the seeding with what's called a bonded fiber matrix. And this is essentially just a mixture that goes into the hydro seeding that gets sprayed on that allows for a good and neat and quick establishment. We recommended that they mix some rye and fescue in with the New England erosion control mix because the rye and fescue germinates faster than the other stuff, so it will provide some initial protection before the other stuff comes up. And we recommended that they do a second overseed, so after that initial stuff has had time to establish, you go back again and do another application to make sure that you get the stuff in the ground. We wanted them to look at stormwater controls at the top of the slope so that you weren't getting water running down there. From what I understand, the slope actually is the other direction at 51 Lawrence Street, so the water will not tend to drain down that hill, but to drain back towards Lawrence Street. But in any regard, that needs to be looked at to make sure that you don't have high-velocity water running down the slope that originated up on Lawrence Street. We asked them to look at benching, so retaining walls of sorts to break up that slope. And their current plan has a wall at the bottom that at least partly meets that request. And most importantly, that the slope be monitored and any erosion that develops be repaired before it gets bad and turns into big gullies and all that. And that's really of greatest benefit to the people that will end up living there. So the applicants certainly have impetus to look after that because it would be ugly eyesore and a problem to the people that end up living in those houses. Next. So these things have all been agreed to by the applicant. Next, please, Amy. So, summary, that's all the issues. Now, this is a summary of the recommendations. The town should submit comments on the final part of the groundwater discharge permit application when that is eventually submitted. We recommend that the treatment plant be designed to the highest levels required for facilities within the 2-year time of travel to a public drinking water supply well. Agreed to. Next, please. We recommended that for phosphorus that they maximize the unsaturated thickness beneath the disposal beds. They're currently looking at a thickness between 13 and 35 feet, I believe, so that's pretty good. Build extra capacity into the treatment plant, and we should talk a little bit more, or there will be some talk a little bit more about how that occurs, but what I anticipate is that it'll be sort of a modular design, so both the leaching field and the facility itself will have some space for adding on in later time to allow additional capacity. And there's also existing additional capacity just in the way the math works for how these things are designed. You design for a high flow that doesn't really ever exist, so there's extra capacity built in already. We want them to provide curbside public water supply shutoffs, so in case any homes on Lawrence Street either choose or end up having an issue, the option is there for available public water supply connection. And lots of pre and post construction monitoring between the treatment plant site and the Lawrence Street wells, and also between the treatment plant site and the town test well site. Next, please. All agreed to by the applicant. With the stormwater basins, we want them to ensure that they meet the stormwater standards with regard to separation from high groundwater. Look into the waiver for the town excavation bylaw and the steep slope stabilization and monitoring that we were just talking about. And I believe all of those were agreed to by the applicant as well. And that is the summary. So don't know if we want to go to questions now or...
Does the board have any questions for Neil? Okay, very good, Neil, thank you. You enjoy your job too much. At this time, we're going to hear. Okay, Dan, go ahead.
Actually, Neil, could you actually answer a few questions I had? Some of the discussion that you just provided was technical in nature, and I just want to make sure that everyone... Is this microphone on? Can you all hear me? All right. I'll speak up. When you spoke of the 2-year time of travel, can you elaborate a little bit more on what that means and what the significance of that is, and specifically the implications with respect to what's in this effluent, the fact that it's not just nitrogen, we're talking about viruses, we're talking about emerging contaminants, pharmaceuticals, and what does the higher level of treatment do? What's the significance of that recommendation that you're making?
So 2-year time of travel refers to how long it takes for the groundwater at the disposal site to travel to whatever its destination may be. In this case, we're talking about a drinking water source. So this treatment facility was calculated by the applicant to be a 1-year time of travel from the town test well site. And the reason we talk about 2 years is the state regulations have different criteria for the level of treatment that a wastewater facility has to provide. The most strict level is for a 2-year time of travel and less. So what we've recommended and the applicant has agreed to do is provide the highest required level of treatment that the state looks at for any wastewater facility, even if it was, in close proximity to a large public water supply well. There's a lot of different parameters. I mean, there's the nutrients that Dan was talking about. There are bacteria and pathogens. There are pharmaceuticals that everyone takes and flushes down the toilet, other emerging contaminants. All of this stuff is addressed in the requirements for the design of a treatment facility in meeting that criteria of being less than 2 years time of travel from a public supply well. Perhaps the biggest aspect of that is what's called total organic carbon treatment. So total organic carbon if you treat for total organic carbon, you will treat for anything that has carbon in it, which is pretty much everything. So that will get pharmaceuticals, that will get some organic compounds, chemicals, and it's quite expensive. So that's the big thing that really is a lot that's being offered here, is to do an expensive level of treatment that will hit the total organic carbon reduction.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the 2-year time of travel is the preferred distance from a wastewater source to a sensitive receptor, that ideally we have a 2-year time of travel, and that provides some safe level, a default level of safety. If you're under 2 years, then the DEP would typically require you to provide some sort of elevated level of treatment, such as what you're describing.
Correct.
That kills this bad stuff at its source so that it doesn't become a threat to closer sensitive receptors such as wells.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
And it's worth pointing out here that these town test wells are not an active licensed drinking water supply. So it's a little bit of an unclear situation if the state would actually require this level of treatment. So that's why I'm saying that it's kind of a good thing that we've agreed to this here with the applicant, because it's not certain that it would necessarily be required in this situation. In fact, I've worked on a project very similar to this where it went the other way around, and the state essentially said first come, first served. You come in with a wastewater plant, you don't have to meet these requirements because the well has not been developed or permitted yet.
Okay. And then with respect to, well, let me take a step back. So this treatment that we're talking about, is there some kind of radiation treatment? What exactly is the plant doing to?
I think I'll leave that to the applicant's engineer that designed that, who will discuss what exactly they have in mind. I honestly don't know what they're planning to do. There's many ways that you can meet these requirements with different types of plants and technologies.
Okay, so they'll speak to that when they have their turn. All right. I guess that's all I have right now.
At this time, the applicant's hydrogeologist, Stephen Smith, is going to speak. Stephen?
Excuse me, for the record, Thomas DePlacido. I feel like if Steve Smith spoke now and he's available here for questions, I feel it'd be actually very redundant to what Neil Price actually presented. It'd be almost the same information over again with that. We were prepared to actually make a presentation, to have him make a presentation, but because we didn't know what Neil was going to talk about, but I feel like it'd be very redundant with that. But he's available here for questions. What I'd like to do, with the board's permission, just so we don't talk about the same exact presentation again almost, is introduce Carlos Quintel, the engineer for the treatment plant, to talk about the level of treatment and to where we're going with that, to meet that 2-year time of travel treatment, and answer some of the questions that Mr. Price could not answer with that. I think that makes the most sense, and we're here available for questions with a hydrogeologist should we need be.
I think that's fine. Thank you. So we'll turn over to Carlos.
Good evening, members of the board and public. My name is Carlos Quintel, CAQ Engineering Associates. I will be designing this wastewater treatment plant for this project. To date, the extent of what we've done is only digging test pits witnessed by DEP. Steve Smith did the hydrogeo study. Yes, I can. Thank you. The hydrogeo study was done. This is a little, I was kind of counting on Steve's presentation to get to answer my questions, but we'll make it work. There are certain things that we've done, and there's certain things that we will have to do, and some of them are part of that, and maybe this generates some questions, which will be good. Go to the next one. This is just, I'm going to talk mostly about the treatment plant, what we're going to do for treatment, and the levels of treatment that we have to provide. I'll talk about the wells that will have to be monitored and how we get to where we go. To start with, this is the site right here. You can see it all boxed off. The leaching area is right on that point, and I have a real steady hand. And then you have the test wells are back here. From this perspective, and from the perspective that the proponent has agreed to provide the opportunity for that test well to be developed as a drinking water supply, I no longer have a choice. I have to assume that it's there, it's going to be there, and it's going to be active. Looking at that, DEP will tell me that if that's the case, then I'm certainly within the 2-year time of travel, and therefore I must provide the best quality. The presumption is that water system is going to be working. It's going to be supplied public water, so I don't have a choice. I'd like to tell you that we're just being nice guys and giving it to you, but DEP wouldn't let me do it otherwise, whether you trust them or not. That's pretty much where it goes. This also shows, and you see the black line around is the water supply for the 2 Franklin wells. So that puts us into a zone 2 to begin with. Under the zone 2, DEP will require that we discharge water with a total organic carbon of 3 milligrams per liter. Once we get inside the 2-year time of travel, that number drops down to 1. What that means is that we have to treat the effluent to a quality in which the total organic carbon gets used up. Total organic carbon, as was discussed before by Neil, is a soluble carbon. Just to kind of explain what the process goes through, we have to add a carbon source to the typical process to get rid of the nitrates. So we're kind of undoing what we have to do, but ultimately that's the only way to get there. In order to be able to get to the levels that the permit, and I'll go through a permit that will be similar to this facility. In order to get to those levels, I need to reduce all the nutrients. I need to get rid of all the nitrogen. I need to get rid of phosphorus. I need to get rid of BOD. I need to get rid of suspended solids, and I can go on. To that degree, what we have to do, and part of the treatment process, is that we have to take the organic carbon, which is soluble. So I can't tell you that I'm just going to precipitate it and get rid of it. I can't collect it. So what we have to do is to actually provide the treatment to a level where the little bugs that are looking for food and looking for that carbon source have to actually go through and go attack that soluble organic carbon and use it up. And until I get to that stage, there's no real other way to get rid of it. So that is the strictest point. It's a critical piece. Phosphorus not. We're talking about phosphorus. Phosphorus will not be an issue, because if I can't reach that phosphorus level, I've had some major violations on the plant. So from that perspective, I'll go through a typical permit so you can have an idea of what we have, how the process goes. Next, please. Thank you very much. Typical, this is a draft permit for a different plant, but it has the same TOC level of 1 as the ultimate discharge. Just scroll it up a little if you could. And you can see that what we have for influent on this particular, you go through all the, no, not so fast. Well, seeing that he's no longer presenting, I have to use up his time. No. We have, you can see this is what your typical constituents would be. And then you go through, now you can go up one more. The levels have to be treated to here. And this all sounds somewhat stringent, but yet, the only thing that bothers me here from a perspective of meeting the criteria is I have to get the TOC of 1. These upper parameters, 5 milligrams per liter, they'll be met, they'll have to be met in order to be able to get the TOC of 1. This is, again, a standard permit. If you scroll up a little, please. Next. Yep. You can see, I'll let you read it, but some of these things that we have to test for, you're looking at the next thing that will give you a good clue on how the plant performs, is the turbidity. We'll have to make sure that stays low, otherwise you don't get the treatment. You're looking at fecal coliform. I think these are standard testing that happen on a daily basis. The average of the BOD and TSS, they're standard. This is a standard permit. I think we'll get into some of the better parameters coming up. Again, please. So here is what typically a treatment plant has to be operated. It has to be operated daily by a certified operator by the state of Massachusetts. Somebody who can put his license on the line and say that I'm operating and I'm treating and I'm reducing all the constituents and I'm testing. The testing has to be done and submitted to DEP and the local Board of Health monthly. And just to elaborate a little bit on the monthly is, if you take a test on a monthly basis and you wait until the end of the month and you have a hit, you have a problem, because that's a violation, and there's the limit of violations before DEP will issue a notice of non-compliance. So it's pretty typical that an operator will test either early in the month or do some interim testing so that he knows what the plant is performing. As the flow changes, as the characteristic changes on a day-to-day basis, certainly as the project is ramped up, when you go from lower flow to a higher flow, there are a lot of adjustments the operator has to make. So therefore, the reason why the operator has to be there. Typically, the permit reads that the operator be there 5 days a week. You can pick the 5 days. Typically, the operators like to have the weekends off. Not an issue for something like this. In a industrial or a restaurant situation where you have weekend flows, then you change that. Those 5 days get moved. Next, please. These are typical. This is what we will be testing for, and DEP will tell you what they want you to do. A composite sample means that you have to take representative samples, collect them as one, and test them. Grab sample is just that. You take a sample and you run it to the lab. You can see that the things that we'll be testing for, and this has come up in the discussion, total phosphorus is going to be tested quarterly. Orthophosphate will be tested quarterly. And those are typical. And I have to say that DEP has implemented this testing for plants that don't have the stringent level in places. In this case, they will be putting this in. And if you look at the MEPA responses that were issued by DEP, this is all in there. This is their standard permit. This is what they're suggesting we have to do. Up one, please. This is just a continuous thing. You can see that's repetitious. You have to test the effluent. You have to test the wells, the monitoring wells. Keep going, please. I think we talked. Yeah, let's stop right there. This is one of the permit conditions is that the ownership has to provide a financial statement, has to provide a means by which they have X number of dollars available. And the X number of dollars here is critical, is that right now they've changed this. It's just one account with 25% of the cost of the equipment, and that has to be available for immediate repair and replacement and any other things that they have to do to the plant, and then it needs to be replenished. So that needs to be maintained. That is how DEP makes sure that there is a financial agreement. There has to be one entity that has ownership, and that'll come into a discussion a little later on. In a condominium association, it's fairly simple to do. It's just you're one of the members, but as you get away from that, it becomes a little more difficult to establish that. Keep going up, please. I think we're supplemental conditions. I think you see this is where it gets into operation. That last paragraph, number 3, tells you that DEP is requiring that as before we go online that we provide from the operator a staffing plan. And that just is something that tells DEP that they do have enough people to monitor. You have to understand this is a business for the operator. The operator more than likely does more than one plant. Not going to survive otherwise. So they have to make sure that they have enough people on their staff, and DEP is cracking down on that so that we don't get bottles of water tested for samples. Up one, please. Operations and maintenance, part of the what we have to do before the plant will go online is we'll have to put together an operation and maintenance plan, which will spell out who the operator is. You can see here in 5A that this facility happens to require a grade 3 operator. A lot of the good operators these days are 4 or 5s, a couple of 6s out there. But bottom line is you need a good operator, and that's going to be, it'll certainly be my recommendation that we don't just hire an operator, but we hire a good one. Okay, up one. Keep going. Hang on. Let me just see what this is. Standard, typical to, as if you had a septic system in your home, there's a requirement that the solids, we'll be taking the solids out. Part of the, and this is probably a good time to talk about the phosphorus. Phosphorus is removed. The only way we can remove it is by adding a coagulant. We typically add is alum. Alum will adhere to the phosphorus and precipitate it. Becomes part of the solid byproduct of the plant, and it doesn't carry through. The rest of this, I think we're repeating here. The financial plan contains estimates of implementing the facility. I think that I can answer some more questions on the plan itself. There was a question by Attorney Hill about how to treat the current process, or the one that's in place actually in one plant that has a TOC of 1 is by using carbon. Using carbon, ultraviolet, more carbon, more ultraviolet, and that in theory should work until the results are out. The truth of the matter is there are no plants out there with a TOC of 1 that have been performing that we can go back and look at the results. That's fairly new in the requirements. The one plant that I know of is in Sharon. And lastly, if you up a little. This is one of the slides that I was hoping to just be repeating. That's good. Thank you. This is one of the slides that Steve has used for his geohydro study. And again, this is the two areas for the leaching. And let's just touch a little bit on what we have. Based on these, the blue lines, the contours, those are the mounded groundwater contours based on groundwater itself and the mound created by the discharge. And you can see how the flow goes up, or the elevations go up. Right here, you're looking at about 174.5 as being, that's okay, it's all right. Right there is good. 174.5 is roughly where the bottom of the lower section of the system is. At that point, we have about 13 feet of separation to the bottom of the leaching area. And that's based on current grading. If you use existing grading, I go down below surface, the amount that I have for a leaching trench, and we have about 13 feet. And as you get up to the top at this end, we're around 38. So that, you know, it's a sloped section. I think if you recall the site plan, that whole middle area just goes up. And if I remember correctly, is roughly a 5% slope, but somebody else can talk to that. The other thing that's shown on here that's important, let's talk about these first, and then we have to, as part of the permit, we're talking about having to test and submit reports to the state. Not only are we testing the discharge, which is taken right at the plant, but we also have to test monitoring wells. And the monitoring wells typically, based on, as it was discussed by Neil earlier, groundwater flow is going in that direction. So we need an uphill well that's going to show us, and that's this one right here, it's going to show us the quality before it hits the discharge from your treatment plant. And then your typically DEP will look for two downhill wells, one uphill, one downhill. And the downhill wells would be, you know, in this case, it's these two, which will pick up any constituents that you may not have treated. If stuff gets discharged, that's your first point of other than the effluent itself, which is that's your key, that's your alarm. But if it gets through, it'll show up on those too. Part of the discussion that we had certainly is, if you can just zoom out a little, please. We talked about putting in a couple of wells. We're talking one here and one here. Those are in between the discharge and the wells. The wells are right here. These are the test wells for the water supply. And if you look at these blue contours, things are going that way. Some of this may be coming this way, but ultimately they're going to either hit that or that well before they get to the water supply. So those will be in place to indicate, to be tested and indicate if there's anything coming in that might be of interest to the water supply. On the other side, we're also concerned about making sure that this piece right here is monitored, and that's monitored for two things. It's monitored to make sure that the effluent out of this, if it's finding its way towards those, that we have a mechanism in place to know that something out of this plant's coming and it's going in that direction. But it also provides the opposite, which is if something is coming down that hill, it's going to be picked up by those two wells as a uphill hit, and not necessarily something that the plant has discharged. So it serves two purposes. In this case, we agreed to do that, and it makes all kinds of sense. From my perspective as the designer, I would ask that those two would have been added anyway, so it all worked out the right way. I think this is probably a good place for me to stop. There are a couple items that were discussed before that I don't have any specific information on a slideshow, but the phosphorus we talked about, I can talk a little bit about that. We have, just as an example, we have a treatment plant where alum is being added, and it's being added to reduce turbidity. That was a pilot program that we did. It worked, and it's been in operation for now about 10 years. And that's for the Pond Home, the nursing home in Rentham, where we actually test for phosphorus and orthophosphates. And that number is not a problem. Typically, it doesn't show up, or it shows up in very small numbers. I think if you look at, and perhaps we need to talk about this, I didn't say anything, but there was a discussion brought up by Neil that if you take this piece, and I as part of the answers to some of Neil's questions, and I assume you have them, and you can certainly refer back to them. There was an analysis that I did based on having this section of the site, and this is a small portion of the site, just this side of the river. If that were to be developed as a conventional subdivision, house lots with septic systems, which by law you should be able to do, or can do. You know that better than I do. But if you look at that and you think about the phosphorus, typical phosphorus for a septic system discharge is somewhere between 7.2 and 17 milligrams per liter. National average, 8.6. If you take those, and there was a plan submitted to for the MEPA process, which showed, I believe, 46 homes on this side of the river. So if you can just imagine, and that's all you need to do for now, because it really doesn't have ultimate ramifications, but if you take 46 lots and you put them there, and you think about 46 septic systems scattered throughout, they'll be spread out evenly because those lots will have to meet a certain area. They'll all be discharging at that between let's just talk about the average, 8.6. So you create an ambient condition of 8.6. We're looking at something totally different, and I'm offering that as part of the discussion we had on the reduction. What's being provided here with one discharge point, much further away from the river than anything else, and the point has been made that phosphorus attaches itself to the particles. That's correct. You're discharging something that's going to be much better quality. And I don't want to use a number, but I certainly know it's going to be way less than 8.6, and that's one discharge versus 46. So there's a very large reduction in total phosphorus that should not be an issue for here. I must also say that my interpretation of TMDLs are based in they're part of surface water. And if you look at the definition, I'm not picking on anybody, but definition of TMDL refers to surface water 3 separate times, and that's what they're going after, and that's what the municipal part of this, and that's why it's hung up in court, because municipalities have to look at what they have for surface water discharge, and that's every catch basin, every piece of pavement, right on down to the final discharge to any river, in this case Mill River, and they have to reduce. That's tough to do. Municipal treatment plants, because they have a point source discharge, they'll have to do that as well. And if you read some of the literature that's been put out by EPA, it'll be pretty difficult for them to do. So when somebody suggests that they may be, or they're intended to come online within the next year or two, I'd be pressed to accept that. I just don't see it happening because the municipalities can't hit it. So, but this is the municipality, and I guess the point I'm trying to make is that we do not qualify for the TMDL reduction, but we're giving it to you. We're providing it. And we're providing it because we can, and because if you compare what we're proposing to do as opposed to what could happen by right, there is a significant reduction in nitrogen, in total phosphorus. As far as the additional capacity, that's the last point I want to touch on. The plant is intended to be a 64,000 gallon a day plant. Historical records from similar treatment plants for residential use, they all show that most plants are running tops 70%, and that's for one that probably has some issues in filtration, which won't be an issue in this case. But they typically are lower. They're somewhere around the 65% of design flow. The plant will be designed, both the plant itself and the leaching area will be designed for the 64,000. So if you take the 15% difference between the 65 and 80%, and 80% is the number that DEP will hold you to. You will not exceed 80% of design flow, not without increasing the design process itself. That's additional capacity that's available. Now, having said that, and again, on my responses, you'll see that could mean as much as 20 houses, 20 some odd houses. I have to warn you that you can have all the desires in the world. Legally connecting those houses or anything outside of the condominium association into the association presents lots of problems, and the problems that go both ways. And problems of ownership, because you will now, if you tie in your home, you will now be a proud part owner of a treatment plant in all its problems, if they have any. So if I was in the butter, I'd vote no, but that's just me. You certainly are entitled to your opinion. And you'd have to be part of the financial part of it. It's been tried, and I've worked in several projects where we had failing systems all around a town-owned treatment plant, and they tried, and God knows they tried to tie in some of those units. It hasn't worked yet. So that's my experience, and I'll stop there. Do you have any questions?
Sure. Carlos, can you just elaborate a little more on the carbon treatment? And I think you mentioned something to the effect that there's no experience in Massachusetts right now with a plant that does reduce the total carbon down to 1 milligram per liter. So if that's the case, why does the state have this 1 milligram per liter requirement if no plant is actually achieving it?
Oh, because they established that based on as Neil has said, there's a need to address some issues, and typically this is coming back in a different way, but it's coming back to pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals are tough to get. You know, they're dissolved. You know, you use them. If you use them at home, you know you're every time you go to the bathroom, something's going out that's residual, that doesn't get used up by your body. That goes into the waste stream, and somehow you have to catch it. There's ways of catching it, but none of them are feasible. So that by reducing the total organic carbon, which are part of those pharmaceuticals, you will get to that one. That's an arbitrary number, and I, quite frankly, have had this discussion with DEP. What happens if no one meets it? I know I've had other problems like this, and ultimately DEP would probably just look the other way. There was a time when if you were an owner of a piece of property that exceeded 10,000 gallons, was a treatment plant. Then DEP got some pushback, and now if you can do a fee simple sale, you can go back to septics.
So how do you reduce the total organic carbon? What is the technology? Is it ultraviolet radiation, or is it something else?
Ultraviolet is part of it. It's a very big part of it, and that you know, at this point, the intent is to use ultraviolet and carbon, two different forms of carbon, not forms of carbon, but hit carbon twice. In reality, you're going to go through the process where you go through the primary treatment, you come in for a carbon hit and ultraviolet, and go back and get more treatment. What you have to do is deprive the carbon from the waste stream, so that the bugs that use up the carbon have to go chase the soluble one. That's the exercise, and in theory, you know, it's like if you're hungry and all you have is a cracker. Well, you might eat the cracker. You prefer a steak, but you know, and then that's the reality. That's the only way that you can get the treatment to that level. It's training the little bugs to go after the carbon.
Okay. And then with respect to phosphorus, I think you said that the way you remove phosphorus is that you're introducing some form of coagulant
Alum.
to which the phosphorus attaches, and that becomes part of the solid waste for the facility. Then what happens to the solid waste in the facility? Is that trucked off somewhere, and where does that go?
It's typically trucked off, yeah. I mean, there's some recycling, so there's some other decomposition, but a lot of the solids will be typically, the rule of thumb is you haul out 64,000, in this case, 64,000 gallons a year. Whether you do it one hit or 2 or 3, that's operator related. It's a function of what's inside. It would be the same as a septic system. If you have a lot of sludge on top and the bottom, you clean it out, and that's what you do here.
And where does that typically go? I mean, I'm just...
A municipal plant.
To where?
A municipal wastewater treatment plant, Upper Blackstone would be one of them.
And what do they do with the sludge? How do they process that? Was it-
What they do is they press it, and it becomes solid waste. You get rid of the liquid, and it becomes solid waste.
And then what happens to that? Is it buried somewhere? Or is it...
I don't know. I can't tell you for sure exactly what happens to that. I would assume it gets put in some landfill or gets incinerated. I'm not sure what they do with that today.
Okay. And then you mentioned you had some experience with some plants that were doing well. I think you mentioned a nursing home in Rentham.
Yeah, Pond Home.
What was the name of that one?
Pond Home?
Sorry.
Pond?
Pond. P-O-N-D?
Yeah.
Okay. And there was a plant in Sharon you mentioned?
Plant in Sharon is a brand-new plant that just went online, and that's a TOC of 1.
Okay. And
But
so
that's not running, so we don't know the results yet.
So when you say that's a TOC of 1, you mean that's the target they're trying to reach?
Correct.
Okay. And that just went online?
I'm not even sure it's online yet, but
Okay.
it's built.
Okay. So that was permitted by DEP with a TOC target of 1?
Correct.
Okay. And so the
Correct.
time will tell whether or not they actually achieved that.
This permit I showed you is for a facility in Boxborough. They have their own wells, their water supply, and they're in the zone 1. So they're going to have the same TOC of 1.
You say Boxborough?
Yes.
But this one's not online either yet? Or is it?
Oh, Boxborough is online. It's been online. It's just
Oh.
permit renewal time, and
Okay.
they hit for new conditions.
So is there any data from that plant as to whether or not they're achieving that target?
Oh, no, we're not equipped for it. That plant was not built for that discharge.
Oh.
That was back in the day when a 3030 was a good effluent. There'll be a significant upgrade to that plant before it can achieve that level.
Questions from the board?
We've talked about plant. How big is this plant? Like, how big is this facility with the filtration and?
Most of the equipment is underground.
It's all-
And I think what you see right here, and this, I don't know if there is a different, I don't have it, that's just fine. The wastewater is going to be collected similar to any other development you have. There's going to be sewer manholes, and you're going to tie into them, and they're going to run down to a central place. That central place for us is not, this is just a discharge. This is just a leaching area. There is going to be, and the site plan would show, there's a building here that is the treatment plant. All the tankage will be outside of that. There'll be a 64,000 gallon primary tank, there'll be an equalization tank, there'll be whatever we decide to use for treatment. That's all going to be assembled in that particular location. The building itself is a 40 by 50. It's more of a garage than anything else. And if you want to, as a reference, if you go to River's Edge, that's the same proponent has a treatment plant. As you drive in, you're looking right at it. And I'll bet you couldn't tell me it's a treatment plant. It's a building. All we house in the building is all the controls. Any chemicals that get added come from there, stored there. But other than that, it's just really a glorified control room. By the way, that brings me to another point that I didn't make before, is that all of these functions are automatically tied into the control panel, which it has to be monitored by an off-site facility. So there's an alarm for everything. If one of the pumps goes, you're going to know. You're going to know which pump it is, and you're going to know whether it's something that you need to get out of bed and come fix, or if you can wait until the morning. It's that level of control that you have to provide, because there's not a lot of flexibility on what you do with a plant once it goes bad. It's tough to get it back. So we know that. There's a lot of experience. The operators don't like to get notices of non-compliance. Neither do the owners.
Thank you. Carlos, you mentioned also about violations. What happens if there's a violation? You don't shut down the treatment plant. What happens?
You don't shut down. You have a period. You have to reply with a return to compliance letter, which basically explains to DEP what are you going to do different to clarify the problem. After a number of violations, that's probably a flexible number. If you continue to have the same violation, DEP will fine you. And I've seen fines from $500 to $55,000. It would behoove you to fix the problem as the owner, and certainly the operator will be pressed to not get some results. Most violations will typically happen is you have, for example, you run out of methanol, which is your carbon source. All of a sudden you have a BOD hit. It's probably a one-day affair, it's probably a two-day affair, and then it goes back to compliance, but it's still a violation. DEP through the Boston office, they have one person who looks at all of those, and when you have 2, 3, they start sending out notices. You probably get a phone call, courtesy phone call, what are you doing about this? And if that doesn't work, comes the notice of noncompliance, which requires a response.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a quick question? What is an example of an operator? Who is that? Is it a company, private company? And who's ultimately responsible for this plant?
The owner's always responsible.
The owners are.
The owner's
They
always
own it.
responsible. Yeah,
They own it, they hire an operator to operate it.
They hire an operator to operate it.
And who would that operator be?
They're certified operators by the state of Massachusetts.
Do they work for the state of
They
Massachusetts?
work, no, they're private.
They're
They're private guys, and they'll, like everything else, you have to be careful, because there's the low bidders, and then there's the low bidders, and then there's low workers. So you have to be careful on what you get, but typically there's some reputable. I mean, I've been around this business long enough. First treatment plant designed in 1984, so I've seen a little bit of this. There's some good operators, and there's some people that I just wouldn't recommend. And that ultimately, it's the word of mouth. If you're reputable, you get the work. If you're not, try the next one.
Thank you. All right, at this time, we're going to open up questions from the public with regard to the hydrogeology that we just spoke about and heard. So if there's any questions from the public, we ask you to come forward, state your name so the stenographer can take it down. And we'd like one at a time. And again, one thing we're going to avoid is, and I'm going to call it coffee table discussions. We'd like you to ask questions, let the board or the peer reviewer answer it. I do not want back and forth conversations between the applicant, the questioner. I'd prefer it come through the board, and we'll answer the questions or lead it to the peer reviewer. I just don't want back and forth from the questioner, okay?
Lawrence Wilson, 22 Lawrence Street.
You have to speak right up to it.
Okay. I just have a question on the plant. For some reason, I thought we'd have a design of the plant this time. Since the last time you were here, you indicated you'd be working on a design, and it would be here to take a look at?
I'm sorry if you understood that. I never said that.
Okay. The other thing was a question as regards to the bedrock. We've had a lot of drought episodes in Norfolk over the last 10 years and so forth. And what I'm wondering, is it possible that at some point with the droughts we've had, that the effluent starts flowing the other way into the bedrock? I don't know if you did a study as to which way the bedrock actually slopes once it hits the bedrock. Is it possible that it could creep south?
So there was no actual field study as part of this project or peer review, nor would there typically be. That's sort of over the top. But in this situation, the typical flow of water should be from the bedrock into that sand and gravel aquifer towards the Mill River. The only way for that to get reversed is for the pressure head in the bedrock aquifer to be less than the pressure head in the superficial aquifer, which could potentially happen if you're pumping hard enough from the bedrock aquifer from a particular fracture or set of fractures that intersect that superficial aquifer in the valley in order to draw water back. But that would be a little difficult to do. It's not impossible, but it's not likely either.
We have had instances where our wells go down, and we note that. Even though we're down a number of 100 feet, we stop pumping, or the quality of the water ends up being a lot more poor in terms of the minerals coming into it. Well, that'd indicate to me that the head's gone down.
Correct, right. But don't forget that the connection has to be there. So just because the head in your well has gone down or even dried out, doesn't mean that there's a direct hydraulic connection between your well and the aquifer in which this effluent will be discharged. There's many, many fractures going in many directions. And that's sort of the challenge with private wells in bedrock, and that's why they typically get dug so deep, is they try to hit as many fractures as possible so that the minute amount of water that's in any one of them, you add it all up and you can get your 4 gallons a minute or whatever you need to keep your house running.
I'm just stating at the end of the day, you don't know.
Lawrence,
Oh,
we've got a question. Come up to the mic.
That's fine.
Okay. Thank you, Neil. Other questions?
Hi, my name is Sue Rayner. I'm on 9 Bush Pond Road. Okay. Okay, my question is, I live on Bush Pond Road, which is parallel road north of Lawrence Street. And I have a bedrock well, and it's 650 feet deep. And I'm very concerned about the water that you say is going from the leaching field downward, and it's going to go towards the river. And the wells are being tested on Lawrence Street, but nothing's being done for the wells of the people who are close to the river on Bush Pond Road, and concerned about the quality and the quantity of the water there. I think you can see, yeah, if you go to the first picture that you had, not that one, the map of the one with the red squares. No, it showed those. Up there on the top right corner, those are our homes of the people on Bush Pond.
Oh, so there's, I can actually give you a little bit of reassurance here.
Okay.
Bush Pond, because it's dammed, is sitting at about 10 feet higher than the Mill River or anything else around it. So it's pushing water outward away from it. So it'd be very difficult, if not impossible, for water from the treatment plant to get into the vicinity of Bush Pond.
And nothing of the effluent would come towards it or down that 650 feet down. There's nothing that.
Well, again, with.
And again, from the AUL or.
Right. Well, as I hopefully tried to get across, with bedrock wells, you never really know with full confidence where all the water is coming from. So I nor anyone else can sit here and tell you that it's impossible that anything can get there. But it is unlikely for all the reasons I went through before, and for you specifically because of the influence of Bush Pond being so much higher than everything else, that wants to drive the water the other direction.
Well, I guess my concern, or thank you, I appreciate that. But if they're going to be doing or offering the potential to get their wells tested for the people on Lawrence Street, I would like that same courtesy as the abutters from Bush Pond Road to be able to have their wells tested as well.
Neil, can I just ask you a question about this? So my understanding as a layperson is that the river serves as basically a barrier for the water that's in the overburden aquifer on the south side of the river getting to the north side of the river. Is
Correct.
Isn't it impossible for the overburden aquifer on this side of Mill River to actually end up on the other side and then basically go uphill towards their well?
Oh, I guess I'm misunderstanding exactly where we were talking about. Is that pointer still? So your house, you're saying you're up over this way?
Those squares, the lots.
Oh, up here?
Yeah.
Oh, Yes, even more to the point
But,
than.
but a 650-foot.
I know, right, right. So again, you don't know, it's possible that one of those fractures is coming all the way back like this, but it's a long reach. And as Dan said, the fact that you're on the other side of, so you have this influence I just talked about. I was thinking you were talking about over here.
No, but where the well is towards the far back, yeah, back. Yeah, the edge, no,
Right here?
yeah,
Okay.
towards the edge.
So, yeah, you've got the combined protection that I mentioned with the high water here. The fact that you're on the opposite side of the river that Dan was mentioning makes it also very difficult. So if your well were to get effluent from the treatment plant, it would have to come from a fracture that extends clear across this way into the valley where the effluent is being
And there's
discharged.
no concern about the AUL? I mean, anything that's
Yeah.
been buried way down with no,
Well, and it's
Something.
the same situation, right? So the AUL, anything from the AUL that migrates off is going to want to go into the Mill River and go out.
okay.
It would be, again, really difficult for, if there was a crack that was coming here, it's not impossible, but it really would want to get into the river before it would get down into, and your well pumping at a few gallons a minute is not going to create enough of a draw to overwhelm the larger picture hydraulics going on in the neighborhood.
But if I could just add another point, I mean, this is the reason we don't have, the reason we're proposing these very strict conditions on treatment for the viruses, for the pathogens, for the total organic compounds, is because we don't have 100% certainty, because we do have bedrock wells. If we didn't have bedrock wells, this really probably wouldn't have been a big deal.
Exactly.
And actually, the applicant's hydrologist, Steve, is aware of this debate because Steve has been involved in 2 other projects, 40B projects in other towns, with the same issue. And so what zoning boards have been doing, this is not precedent. There is precedent. We're not setting precedent in Norfolk. It's actually been working in other towns, is that we put conditions on the 40B permit to make sure that we have that safety net, so that if in case there is some crazy fracture that goes all the way from the treatment plant to your well,
Exactly.
before the water even gets in that fracture, it's been treated at a very high level.
Okay,
So that I think is where the zoning board's headed for these kind of issues.
thank you. Thank you.
Hi, guys. My name's Bill Youngs. My daughter lives on 8 Mill River Road, which isn't that close. But I have a question relative to fractures in geology. I'm sort of semi-ignorant to the cut and fill diagrams, but was blasting considered as an effect or no effect or any effect on the fractures in the wells?
He's right.
To be honest, I can't comment. I didn't look at, I don't know what the blasting plan is, or if there is even a blasting plan, and wasn't really part of what we looked at.
And in addition, point to that, having a lot of experience with blasting, about 42 years, and dealing with fracking in New York and West Virginia and Pennsylvania, this had become a major issue. The other thing is the influence of nitrates, because every explosive has nitrates in it. So that would increase the amount of nitrates that could be and likely to occur in the water. So I didn't know if that consideration was taken at all.
Tommy, do you have a blasting? What's going to happen with the blasting? Are you doing any blasting? I thought the last meeting you stated there wouldn't be any blasting.
The only reason I bring this up is because of the fracking issues that have happened and the influence of water flows as a result of fracking. And it's a different kind of blasting, but blasting's blasting, especially in a homogeneous rhyolite type of rock.
It's been mentioned before, and we are not expecting any blasting on this site with that, even though we do have significant cuts in different areas. Where you do see outcroppings and ledge in some of the areas that were excavated before, we're actually filling those areas in around the ledge that's exposed. I have Steve, our hydrogeologist, up here behind me, just to give some average depths to the bedrock below where they are, and to make you feel a little more comfortable with that. Can I guarantee we're not going to have a big boulder or something else that we've missed along the site? But we've done, I can't, but we've done numerous tests and test holes, and we just do not see where we're going to be blasting ledge in different areas.
So there is an overlay of the cut and fill relative to the existing elevations?
Just sign the paper here. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Steve Smith. I'm with GeoHydrocycle, and I'm the geohydrologist who's been working on this project since about 2015. Give me, go down 2 slides, I think. Stop there. This figure shows the elevations of bedrock beneath the site, and it doesn't really give you a good idea of what the separation distance between the land surface and bedrock is. Can you go back one, please? We have bedrock outcrops shown in this portion of the site. There's also a very large bedrock outcrop here. And so these are areas where basically bedrock is right at the surface. Throughout the rest of the site, bedrock is down on the order of anywhere from 20 to 80 feet, based on the information we have from some of the borings that we've done in and around the site. I don't think we anticipate any blasting, if blasting were to occur. There are state standards on the amount of energy that can be transmitted from blasting sites, and that would all be monitored with geophones.
Thank you.
Mike Judici, Eagle Drive. If I could just follow up, Mr. Chair, through you. So now, Amy, could you go to that next figure that you had, the bedrock contours? So at the very least, Mr. Chair, could we request that, as Mr. Young's alluded to, the applicant take this contour of the bedrock elevation and overlay it with the final grading plan of the development so that we can actually see what the final grades will be in comparison to the bedrock surface, taking into account excavation depths for foundations for each of the buildings, so that we have a better understanding and better confidence that there won't be blasting here, because a lot of us are very concerned and expect that there will be blasting necessary. And as a follow-up question to either of the hydrogeologists, just in general terms, could they talk about potential impacts from blasting on wells that are that close to the site in terms of turbidity, potential volume issues, or even radon? We have radon systems in most of the houses in this area, so it is a concern. I just wanted to see if anyone could comment on that. Thank you.
I'm going to answer the latter first, Mike, because I think they just said they weren't doing any blasting. So I would say that the second question probably is not applicable. Tommy, do you want to address, or does Steve want to address the overlaying of the hydrogeological map to the finished grade?
I think I'd actually ask Rick, our civil engineer, to talk about that. I think we can provide that overlay if you don't have some of that information available now.
Good evening, Rick Goodrow with United Consultants. What we had done as part of Neil's review was to provide the elevations of the finished grades at the various monitoring wells that you're seeing around the site, and then what the either depth of groundwater was, or the depth of the bottom of the boring was, or seasonal high groundwater corrected in various locations around the site. And at all of those locations, there was in excess of 10 feet of soil being proposed. In some cases, there were, in the case of MW6DX, there was existing about 7 feet of soil. That area is being proposed to be in a fill condition, so there'll be in excess of that. There's no cut being proposed at that area. So we did look at all those various well locations where we had depths to, as I said, either groundwater or refusal, or just the depth of 60 feet that was requested for the drilling. But we could certainly take that map and overlay it with the contouring map, and then give you a general idea of what the cuts would be at each area.
Okay. Thank you.
Chris Wagner, Park Street. On all these, and in the hydrogeological study, there was evidence that there weren't any borings up in the northern part of the site. Like if we went to that other image, the deepest cuts are in the north part of the site, the highest elevations are there, and there's no borings there, and we don't have any bedrock examples to the northwest in the direction of the potential public well. So I think we would need more evidence as to the bedrock elevations to the northwest to have any idea what kind of blasting there would be there. I mean, we just don't know. And as far as like where the bedrock outcrops, we can see on here.
Did you ask about some blasting?
I'm asking about to know the overlay of like the finished grade to the bedrock. We don't know where the bedrock is, which could ultimately lead to blasting to the northwest, which impacts the public well, basically everything we're talking about tonight. And then where those bedrock outcrops are, we do have, Mr. Reardon had the cut and fill analysis, and surrounding those there's fill areas, but there's 3 distinct red cut areas right where the bedrock outcrops are. So, and there's supposed to be houses right on top of that based on the maps. I tried to overlap them myself. It's kind of, cut and paste. It's not as detailed as what engineers could do. So I think we really need to pull all this information together and really know where all the bedrock is. There just haven't been borings, the areas where there's going to be the deepest cuts.
Sean, can you address what risks would be presented by blasting in that area of the project site? I mean, the municipal well that's being discussed is not going to be constructed until after the blasting would be occurring, I assume.
Correct.
And would the blasting in that area have any impact on any of the budding wells that we've been discussing on Lawrence Street or Bush Pond Road?
Highly unlikely, and it's important to understand too that the applicant can't just go out and blast. In order to blast, you have to pull a permit from the fire chief, and there are very, very, very restrictive ways in which you can blast. And I think the hydrogeologist mentioned that they restrict tightly how much energy you can put into each blast, so that the concussion doesn't travel very far. So it's really, really tightly controlled. Just to advance kind of Rick's discussion, so what we can do very easily, I don't know if you recall, but we did an overlay map of the cuts and fills. We can very easily take the surface finish grade, overlay it with the bedrock, and determine if there's anywhere that, by color, whether that bedrock extends up into the either the sub-base or into the finished grade. So we can do that relatively easily.
But I think, is your name Chris? I mean, Chris's point was that we don't necessarily know where the bedrock is up there, right? And so I think that, I guess the question would be, does it matter? I mean, does it matter if we don't know where the bedrock is in that area of the site?
Well, I think it does to test whether or not they're going to do blasting. So I think the representation that everybody's concerned about is there going to be blasting.
But if there's blasting up there, is that a problem? I guess that's my point. Is it really a big deal if there's blasting in that part of the site, which is so far away from?
Perception is reality. I tend to think blasting is a better option to other pneumatic hammering and things like that. It's far less disruptive. I think it conjures up more startling images, but in reality, it's a very, very controlled application. I wouldn't be concerned if I was a couple hundred feet away from a blast site, just because I know how small the blasts have to be. Anything over that, as the further you get away from it, the more it diminishes how much it's going to impact you. But it is very, very tightly regulated. A lot of precondition surveys have to be done in order to substantiate that there was no damage beforehand and afterhand. Huge insurance obligations, so really a tightly controlled scenario.
If a well was going to go into that area, if a well was to go in that area at a future time, would blasting be required to construct a well?
No, what they do is, if it's a municipal well, it's going to have to be, the geologist can tell, it's more going to have to be in a gravel area, so it can draw from a larger volume. They drill a hole, they wouldn't blast anything. They might hydrofrac or something like that to create fractures, but you'd probably be better off.
The test well site is an overburden site, the surface soils. So the drilling will go into the surface soils, and blasting will have no effect on those wells whatsoever.
But will blasting be required to build a well in that area? Should we?
No.
No. Is that the concern, Chris, that blasting would be needed in a future time for building a well?
No, more for, I mean, all the other effective blasting, that area is closer to Franklin residents.
I'm not hearing that you need blasting.
I think Chris's concern was blasting for the project.
For this project?
Yeah, and whether or not that would have an impact on any nearby residents.
I think I can actually help on that northwest section out there. Although we haven't done monitoring wells out there, we've done numerous, at least 3 or 4 different excavation holes down as deep as we could go with excavators and things, and hit no ledge or anything like that, because we wanted to make sure, just visually, what we were dealing with, everything. And it's actually just one hill that comes up and back down. So even around the sides of that hill, you don't see any outcroppings of ledge or anything with it. And we've done, like I said, significant test holes with machinery just to go down. There's a difference with these. They're actually monitoring wells and casings put in the ground to test, but we've actually done other perk tests and other things like that around the site to test the site out to make sure that we didn't have significant ledge in areas. The other thing I'd like to add to that is that northwest section of the site is actually separated, and I believe the gentleman that spoke lives over on the Bush Pond area. There's still the Mill River that separates from where that cut would be on the northwest site to where any wells would be on Bush Pond. So I hope that helps to answer.
Chris, does that help?
Yeah, I mean, to a degree, my only, and I know it seems like kind of a sandy hill, and I know there were test pits there. I'm pretty sure they weren't digging down the 60 feet that the proposed cut is going to be in that area. And then other kind of hydrogeologically related, in that area too, there is a certified vernal pool, and right next to it is going to be a basin. I don't know that that's going to exist anymore once the runoff completely changes to that basin. Just another concern I had.
Actually, on that point, Rick, are you planning to provide a revised drainage plan now that to address these separation issues? And when do you expect to get that to the board? A few weeks?
Mr. Chair, I'm Mike Judas, Eagle Drive again. If I could just address Mr. Hill's question, do we care about their blasting? For those of us who have to live here, I mean, let's not kid ourselves. We're going to be living next to a gravel pit for the next 8 years when this starts. So dealing with all the issues associated with that, noise, dust, traffic, blasting is just one more issue that we have to deal with, and we'd like to know going in if there's going to be any that we have to deal with over the next few years. So along those lines, the applicant did mention back when he submitted the construction management plan back in December, he noted that there was no reference to blasting in the plan. that he was going to revise the plan to incorporate that in case there had to be any blasting done. So has that been done? Or if it has not, if that could be done. There were also other issues that were raised that night by myself and others in terms of issues with the construction management plan. Is that plan going to be updated and resubmitted to the board? Thank you.
Tell me.
Just to respond, yes, that will be updated. And if there's anything else that comes from these hearings and presentations that have to be added to it, we want to do one final update instead of keep updating as we go along, so that we can, we capture everything with one final revision.
Does that answer that, Mike? Okay.
Yeah, I'd just like to mention that to say blatantly that it's highly regulated, I just mentioned, is a pretty broad range statement. Energy is not monitored. Vibration is. It's the Susskind curve, which is established by USGS a number of years ago, measures vibration, 2-inch particle velocity. It has nothing to do with energy. It's all vibration. Air overpressure is also measured. Blasters have to submit a blast plan that keeps them within that. That's all. Okay? Now, the licensed blaster has to provide experience and so forth. However, there's not a person in the world that can tell you how a fractured rock is going to be affected by vibration. Even if it's within the limits, no one in this room can tell us that that rock is not going to be affected. There's thousands and thousands of lawsuits. You can see what happened in the New York DEC forbid fracking just for that reason. I just want to pose that. 42 years of experience plus that I have, that's not necessarily true.
Neil, can I get you to come up to the mic again? If blasting would have to be done on that north side, would the monitoring wells pick up any affluents or anything that would affect the wells of the residents? And in what time frame would that be? Is that a fair question?
Yeah, the answer is no. The monitoring wells were placed to protect the private wells from the wastewater treatment plant effluent and protect the test site from the wastewater treatment plant effluent, not something. So first off, the north, if we're talking about contaminants, so people were talking about the components in blasting that could be contaminants. That north side is down gradient from the private wells, so there's no way other than that same out there scenario of a very long crack intersecting that. It's down gradient. It's very unlikely for that to happen. In terms of what the last gentleman was talking about, in terms of does the actual explosive impact affect how open or closed any fractures are, and that's really difficult to try to pinpoint and probably impossible.
Thank you, Neil.
Karen McCabe, Lawrence Street. First, thank you to the board for getting this extra high report, as it was very informative to us, and I think it helped all of our neighbors, so thank you very much for that. In the report, it stated that it was insufficiently to adequately portray any nuances in groundwater flow. So we've discussed all night about groundwater flow, but we're going on statistics that were inadequate. And it states it right in the Horsley-Witten report. So it did ask, and it was not in his report, it was requested that it's inefficient because there's private wells, and we're forgetting all about Franklin's town well. There's a town well too there, that it was insufficient. This is high-risk area with 3, and that there should be at least, I think it said, at least 5. And then also where they are, there's a different figure. It shows they're all in one area. Again, it was closer to the wells, I understand, but it's a larger area of work that they also recommended to be spread out more. So we're going on a lot of assumptions from insufficient information.
Neil.
So let me address the first point, which is about the nuance of the water table. So it's true. Okay. So as you can see, the contours don't extend very far to the east towards Lawrence Street because it's sort of out of the area where there's real data to guide it. The map I made had a little bit more data and extended a little further. Neither showed much in the way of a potential connection between the site and Lawrence Street. As I said in my letter and as you just mentioned out loud, it's not clear cut that you can say conclusively there's no way, no how that water will flow in that direction. And that's the reason for the recommendations about the high level of treatment and the monitoring wells in between and the provision of public water supply stubs. So you got 3 levels of built-in suspenders in case there. So that's the thinking behind that. And to be honest, I wasn't really sure, the tail end of your question, I wasn't sure what you were talking about with that.
So I know a lot of people's like, oh, they're doing this level because there might be a potential of a town well. There is a town well. It just happens to be a different town.
Correct, yeah, so that's further away in the same direction as the test site, and it's longer than 2 years time of travel away. So if you do things that are protective of the town test site, you're by definition doing things that are protective of the Franklin wells too.
And then it was a question too, but on the point, you've said that you'd have monitoring within, I believe, a half-mile radius of the wells. I'm not sure if the wells were going to be the wells that they're going to put on site or the neighboring wells. And it's pre and post. Well, this is an 8-year project. Could possibly be dead for my water if we do it post, because I'm now drinking contaminated water for 8 years.
Well, the pre and post, you do both, right? So that's the idea, is that you...
But during.
And during.
All right.
I mean, I think that's worthwhile, and that's a discussion for Tom and Steve, how people think
I'd
about...
request yearly, because it's going to be
Hold on,
at least
Karen,
an 8-year project.
Karen, let him speak, please.
We haven't specifically addressed that, and I don't know how you guys feel about that, but it's worth, especially if it's going to be a lengthy construction process, I think it is worth. Although, theoretically, the time the wastewater treatment plant comes online will be when in the construction process? While houses are still being built, or?
It's phase 1, so year, I don't know.
So, but when I said post, I'm talking about wastewater treatment plant. So by definition, your post-construction monitoring will still be while the homes are being built, as long as the treatment plant is operating.
So it would be pre is before the wastewater treatment plant, and post is after the wastewater treatment plant, not after 8 years of developing the
Right,
ground.
but it would go on theoretically for the life of the treatment plant in perpetuity.
On a yearly basis?
On
or
some
basis?
schedule to be determined by DEP, probably more than annually, I would imagine. Quarterly, twice a year, yeah.
Just to touch a little bit on that, the monitoring is done on a monthly basis. The EMRs are submitted to DEP on a monthly basis.
So all the wells will be tested,
The
pre
wells
and
have
post on a
to
monthly
be
basis.
tested. And quite frankly, we need a baseline. So before much happens on that site, we'll be taking a set of readings so that we establish what's there today, so that we know that tomorrow we polluted, we know what we did, and if we did it. So if there's an existing condition, we need to find out now. So we'll certainly be sampling before construction, and certainly as construction goes on, that'll be part of what we have to do. Now, granted that the treatment plant testing is only after the plant goes online, so there's a little space in between that perhaps something can be done so that you can test their wells. I think the critical piece is to have, again, a baseline for what they have and how it changes. So I'm not opposed to spending his money. I'm not opposed to testing it and just following it so that you know. I mean, and it works both ways. If there is a bad well out there, I'd like to find out now so that my client doesn't get accused of being the guy who ruined it. And they would need to know. I mean, it works for both.
So on that question, when it's a monthly, you're just discussing the ones that are on site, not the ones for any of these wells up there, right?
Correct.
On all those wells on
Correct.
Lawrence Street, you're not discussing, saying those are tested.
Darren, please direct it.
Yes, so my question is he saying that being tested monthly? I actually am pretty thrilled with what he said, but if they're tested monthly, is it just the ones that are on site, or if it's the ones that are on the abutters within a half-mile radius?
Neil?
So that's a decision to be made by the applicant's team. I suggested the monitoring of the monitoring wells, and we've been discussing that, but also voluntary testing of the private wells if the owners of the wells wanted that and agreed to that. That would not be monthly. Wouldn't make any sense for that to be monthly, but I would think it would make sense for it to be at least baseline now, and at some point, maybe several points in time after the treatment plant comes online, once a year or something along those lines. But I'll leave it up to, discussion from the applicants on that.
Neil, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the treatment plant itself has to produce data based on data that's showing the concentrations of certain things that's being outputted from the plant, and that is nitrogen, phosphorus, et cetera. So those are monthly reports that get filed with DEP. So if those readings are below thresholds, then I would think that would give us some assurance that we're not facing concentrations that are higher than that at down gradient wells.
Absolutely, but I think people are interested in concentrations below that, but maybe higher than what might exist currently. So if a well currently has 0 of something in it, and then has a minute amount of that said something that could be traced to the treatment plant, that's of interest.
Right. But the point is that if the levels coming out of the plant are below the safe drinking water thresholds, I mean, I don't know if that's what your concern is, that they're higher than safe drinking water thresholds, but if you're concerned that the concentrations are higher, then there will be some assurance that if what's being, the readings from the plant are taken at the plant itself. So if those readings are low enough, then it's not going to be higher than that at a down gradient well. I guess that's my point.
Right. So no, it can't be higher. It can only get lower. But there's a little bit of a misnomer. This talk of drinking water quality effluent doesn't really mean, that you're going to put your glass up to the effluent tap and take a big swig. It's
why not?
There are certainly some components that would not meet true drinking water quality standards. It just means it's being treated to a very high level applicable for its location in a public drinking water supply. But one example comes to mind. I think the standard that was on the example permit that Carlos put up for bacteria was 14 colonies per 100 mils or something. So that's allowable in the effluent. It's a pretty small amount, but the drinking water standard is 0. So 14 is obviously higher than 0, and there are probably other examples of that as well.
Neil, I thought the applicant was agreed to doing testing of the neighboring wells, or was that just the on-site wells? Did you and
we didn't
Steve talk about
really? I mean, I don't want to speak. I mean, Tom, do you want to address that, Steve?
Just to respond to that issue, we don't think it's necessary to test these off-site wells. The other thing I wanted to mention as well is that if you're testing wells on other landowners' properties, the real concern is that there might be already existing contamination on the site from existing septic systems, You could test, but they could always fail at any time during the process. So it's not a reliable way to deal with this, and given the data that's provided, it doesn't seem necessary to test these off-site wells.
Neil?
So, valid points, that you don't know what you're going to get, and it would be very difficult to tell the difference between a wastewater compound detected, that whether it came from the treatment plant or whether it came from that house or a neighbor's house septic system. So that's all valid. It doesn't necessarily mean there isn't some value in doing at least the baseline testing and some amount of post-construction testing, but it's not, the concerns are valid, and if they were to be done, there would need to be some kind of a mechanism and understanding for how to deal with the results if something were found, to figure out what the source is so that no one party is unfairly fingered for that.
I think that's that's the most important point. I don't think anyone's proposing to take these tests and monitor the offsite wells to prove liability. The point was just to create a data point so that we would, more of like a canary in the coal mine. All right, here's an aberration. Let's figure out what caused that, and then collect more data.
Just while you're there, in your report that the town received, you reference a 2B on like a, and that is not found in the report that we received. It was, yeah. Yep.
In what, a figure or?
Yeah, yep, it was missing. All your other ones were very nice, but that one was missing from what we received. It actually was here tonight.
Oh, I see.
But we did not receive it in the report.
Okay.
So if you could send along 2B.
Which one was 2B to
Yeah, I'd have to look up in my notes.
Can you sign it?
Yeah, I would have to look at my notes, but then, yeah, you can ask me questions.
Yeah. We'll get back to that.
Hi, Brian Lowe from Franklin. I live on Stewart Street. I just wanted to go on record saying that when the Mill Estates were created, which is Camden Way, which is the last street
Can you speak up, sir?
Norfolk. The last street before you head into Norfolk, Camden Way, Mill Estates. When I was a kid, blasting did occur, and blasting did affect us. We had a picture fall in my house. But my town has been mentioned a few times, and I just want to know what the applicant and what the board will do for notification of Franklin, because I understand that we don't meet your abutter criteria, but I want to know what the board and what the applicant are going to be doing to address Franklin as well, because our well has been mentioned a few times, and I want to know what the applicant and what the board are going to do to notify us.
You got it, Blasted?
I think a generic answer to that question is that the board is not drawing political boundaries with this project. The board is looking at impacts to all wells, all issues, regardless of what town they're in. This isn't a Norfolk review, it's a review of the project. So the board is looking at the impacts on the Franklin wells. That was part of Neil's analysis. And as well as the construction management plan. I mean, that addresses traffic from the project going both, east and west down Lawrence Street. So there isn't any different kind of level of review for impacts in Franklin vis-a-vis Norfolk.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, the last thing I do have to say is that, so the Mill Estates, which is Camden Way, there was blasting that did occur there, and it did affect neighboring neighborhoods, as my neighborhood was, and I just think that the fact that the applicant has yet to address the fact that he will be blasting, because that is along the same ridge line, that Camden Way, the Mill Estates are along that same ridge line that required blasting when I was a kid. I think the fact that the applicant has yet to address that is unethical, and I think he needs to address it. I think he needs to tell us. I think both towns need to be notified as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, he did.
Any other questions with regard to the hydrology?
I need to make a statement. My name's Peggy Udar at 28 Lawrence Street, and I just want to make it clear that your decisions and your restrictions have our lives in your hands. You're amputating us from the town. You are charging us as though we are still town residents. We'll be de facto Franklin residents until this project is closed. I have no children in the school system anymore, and we were
Could you
considering
speak up?
selling.
I can't hear you.
I said that I am going to be a de facto Franklin resident, still being charged Norfolk tax rates. I have no children in the school system anymore and would like to consider selling, but I know no one's going to buy my house at an appropriate price at this point in time. The project has so many costs that come on my shoulders.
Peg.
Wait
Peg.
a minute, wait a minute, sir.
Peg.
I'm going to speak about
Peg.
the well. I'm going
Peg.
to speak about the well.
Could you we're trying to stick to hydrology. So if you
Okay,
can stick to hydrology.
so I
that'd be
will
great.
stick with the hydrology.
Okay,
So my
thanks.
question is, the solution in this report was, if my well fails, then that comes with the suggestion of a pipe coming to my house. That's how the suggestion is, we'll fix it. Who will pay for that well to be hooked up to that pipe to be hooked up to my house?
So what's your question again? If
My
your well
question
fails-
is, if my well fails and I am accessed to town water, who pays for the connection from the town water to my house? No, the connection, the actual connection from town water to my house. Who pays for that?
My understanding is you would pay from the street stub to your property.
Okay. Who pays for the town water?
Obviously, you would pay if you're hooked up to the town
Okay.
water system.
So at what point do we start suggesting that maybe there's a cost inherent in this job to us? And I'm not sure why we're absorbing the cost of that. You need to make decisions that make this viable and not costly to us as current citizens of this town.
I guess your assumption is your well's going to fail.
I think it is an accurate assessment based on the fact that, first of all, there were only 3 wells, and it suggested that there needed to be at least 7 test wells.
Now, you're referring to your well.
I'm referring
You're
specifically.
willing to your well.
Yeah.
So you're saying, I guess what I'm hearing is, if your well fails, what's going to happen?
Yes.
So
Who absorbs that
I guess
cost?
the question would be is, why would your well fail?
Well,
And there
it's
could be a number of
fine
different
right
reasons.
now. It's fine right now.
Okay.
So if it's fine right now, I anticipate it should continue to be fine.
Then
Right?
That'll be a good thing.
Okay.
Okay.
So you know what, I'll move on to another question. Since Dorothea and Patrick aren't here, I'd like to ask some questions about 51 Lawrence Street. Firstly, I'd like to ask, it said it was a 40-foot cut down from their house. I remember hearing a 60-foot cut down from their house. Could someone clarify that?
Neil?
Rick, who actually did the cut and fill, could probably answer it better, but I counted contour lines on the map that he created and came up with 40 feet.
What is the stormwater control? Is that on their property or is that somewhere else?
If stormwater control is needed, and I was told that the drainage goes in the opposite direction, which would imply that it would not be needed, then it would either have to be, it depends on how much space there is, but I would think part of it would have to be on that house's property, depending on how close the cut comes to the property line.
How far away from their property line is this slope?
Actually, when we talk about the landscaping and the grading and stuff, we're going to be able to answer some of these questions and be able to deal with that slope.
Peg, how many more questions do you have?
I have really very serious questions. So if you're cutting so close to their home, very close to their home and their property, what's the risk of a sinkhole?
What was the question?
What is the risk of a sinkhole
Okay, we're going to discuss
on
that.
51?
We're going to discuss that when we get to the landscape.
Okay.
Okay?
All right. I do have other questions. I'd like to know a little bit more about the treatment system. So how long, I believe it was quoted 1984 is when the first one was built. So it's a 33-year-old treatment, or I guess, experiment? It doesn't seem like it has a lot of length or life in it, is my question.
You have some other questions with regard to the wastewater treatment plan?
Well,
Why don't you
yeah.
state all your questions, and Carlos is behind you, can answer them.
Okay, so it seems like it's 24 years old. I'd like to know how long it was made to be a 1% variance. I'd like to know comparatively, Boxborough, Pond Home, Sharon, I'd like to know what the size of those, what development, what amount of lives are being, like how many lives are being, their waste is being treated by this. Because I don't know that it's a fair comparative. I don't know that it's 204 homes. I have other questions, I'm sure.
Okay, why don't we let Carlos answer those ones for you?
This is another question, actually. So, sorry about that. I want to know who is the actual corporation that owns this treatment plant? What is the, how is that ensured that we make sure that if there's failure, that is actually covered? I'd also like to know, I don't really understand how it seems to me there really isn't a plan B if there's an actual failure on this water system. And it seems like it's a kind of lame consequence if there is a failure. There doesn't seem to be a real recourse to correct if there's a real failure on this plant.
Let's see if I got them all. I mentioned 1984. That's my first treatment plant. That's a plant that I designed. Frankly, before that, there weren't too many. They weren't allowed. The state wasn't quite geared up for it, and that's about the time when they came in. I had a surface discharge in Chelmsford. It was permit number 2. Permit number 1 is down the Cape. So you can see that that's when it started. Now that plant obviously is no longer because Chelmsford's got town sewer, but I've got plants that you know, we go through, and the way DEP works is we have to do a, at the end of 15 years, we have to do a report. Basically, we have to analyze the plant, how it's performed over the past 15 years. The expected life of a treatment plant based on DEP is 20 years. And that number came up not because the plant's going to fail in 20 years, but because they want to make sure that whoever the owner is has enough funds to replace the plant at the end of 20 years. So there comes the 15-year report where you analyze it and come up with a discussion. I'm at the point now where I've seen several of these plants that I designed that are now over 15 years, over 20, over 25. They're all still up and running rather well. Once they perform, they start performing, they continue to perform unless you totally neglect them. And if from the past discussion, neglect comes with notices of non-compliance and fines, so that's not likely to happen. As far as size, the biggest plant I did was 120,000 gallons, twice what you have in this particular case. Ownership will be by homeowners association, and whatever the parties are, that they'll create an association which will be responsible for the plant. As I stated before, there will be funds put aside for repair and replacement, so that will be available for any failure that happens. And it's like anything else, it's mechanical. Pumps do fail, you know that. We'll replace them, and then have to replenish the funds into that account. As far as drastic failures with a plant, guys, I don't know of one. I have heard that there have been plants where the association went bankrupt, and that's a separate issue. I obviously neither you nor I can answer that question. We hope that that this is a viable project that is self-supporting, and to the extent that this owner is going to maintain ownership of a lot of those units, I would like to think that he has an interest in making sure that it continues.
Do they normally make you escrow funds for the maintenance and for the replacement of the?
There used to be 2 accounts. One which was immediate repair, and the other one was replacement. DEP has now combined them into just one account. They changed the percentage. Instead of 15%, you're now at 25% of the cost. And that has to be an account that has to be, you have to submit yearly reports to DEP to verify that that account is in, and whatever it is, that they certify that it is a real account. And it's controlled by somebody outside of the homeowners association.
Just add to that in terms of the facility. There's a very thick guidance document on the design, operation, maintenance of wastewater, packaged wastewater treatment facilities that DEP publishes and periodically updates. Includes all the financial assurances that are required, and that's very thoroughly reviewed by the Mass DEP before that plant goes up in operation. So it does provide for reserves, as Carlos had indicated. And continued assurances, they evaluate the structure of the operation of the facility as well. So that's all thoroughly reviewed through the permitting process.
I would like to know who owns this during the development. I'd like to know how many exist and what's the success rate. I'd like to know the cost of the engineer and what would be the cost associated with this to that association, because it has been mentioned that some have gone bankrupt, and this sounds like a very costly way to treat the water. And I'd like to know the standards for the 2 times the size. I'd like to know where and when where that place is, and how successful it is, and if it's under the current standards or the old standards.
That last item, I'm not sure where to take that. There are more plants that I didn't work on, that I don't know about, that have equal or larger capacities. The ones that I've worked on, for the most part, are still on. The Chelmsford was off because they came into town sewer. Ownership, the ownership of a treatment plant is by the developer until such time as there's a percentage of units are built, and then they have to transfer from the developer to the homeowners association. I can't talk to that. That's not my interest. But it starts out with the developer. The developer is fully responsible until he transitions to an ownership to the homeowners association.
All right. At this time, I think I'd like to end the hydrology study, take a 5-minute recess, and then we're... Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, we'll ask one more question.
I will sign it. I'm Dave Diamond from 3 Brett's Farm Road, and I've lived in the neighborhood since the early 90s. And I just wanted to give you a little context. This is really, first I just wanted to know, Mr. Chairman, where are we in the process? Is this our last public hearing?
Oh, we haven't said that. No.
Okay, all right, that's good. So I may have, there's time to do some consideration. My concern is, as having been a resident, is really about water quality. I bought the lot from a bankrupt builder, had a well in it. I called the DEP, so I'm kind of a student of the property. Been down there for several years with a lot of recreational things with my kids. It's been just wonderful. So one side of me, when I look at this development as an abutter, I say, wow, this is a big change. But the other side of me says, hey, if we have this great property on the right-hand side, that's good too. What I wanted to talk about today is the concern about the health risk. And this is for you, Mr. Chairman, and the board. It was really nice we got to have a hearing down at the library or a presentation for MIPA. The Charles River Watershed Association was there, the DEP was there, and the applicant was graceful enough to allow us to have a good walkthrough. Steve and Carlos were there too. Because I was familiar with the property, in particular a process that we went through as petitioners on the town acquiring the golf course, we did have a map that I prepared to take some certain areas, and so I felt it was quite productive. We learned a lot from the walkthrough also, and so I don't think any of the zoning board participants were there, but if there could be a possibility to go do one like that, I think it would be very helpful. And now I just wanted to, I did prepare a letter for the ENF, for the ENF from MIPA. There were 159 pages in the ENF, And there are 150 of those pages were comments from 35 of the abutters and other concerned citizens. And I have just a brief 2-page letter. I wanted to see if I could read into the record. I think it would get a lot off the chest and lower the concern level on water quality. Is that okay?
Go ahead.
Okay. So it was written to Ms. Flaherty, who was a representative from MEPA. And I said, I'm writing you to express concerns about the environmental health risks associated with Abbeville development project, which was referred to by the zoning board as approvals for 17 Lawrence Street, etc. In particular, I'm most concerned about the risk to human health, both due to the condition of the site as it stands today, but more importantly, what could happen to the land if it to be developed without recognition of the potential for increased health risks. I spoke about this at the recent hearing at the library, and again, when I attended the site walkthrough with you, we then visited what was called the hot spots, the areas of concern that were identified during a public involvement plan process, which was started back in 2001 when the town was considering purchase of the land from Buckley and Mann, who to the best of my understanding is still the owner of the property. In particular, I'm very concerned about the current risk of cancer to people who utilize the private well water in Norfolk, and for the potential for future increased risk for those with private wells in the area of development. In addition, I am very concerned about the potential for a new well to be owned by the town, establishing close proximity to the area of use limitation. Norfolk already has a significant increased rate of cancer. It is reported by the Massachusetts Department of Health that Norfolk, which is highly dependent on well water for human consumption, has a higher rate of cancer incidence than expected. Here are some existing incidences which are much higher than expected for residents in our town. Female breast 127%, female colon 103, male leukemia 118%, greater than expected, melanoma 140, and male lymphoma 104, male stomach, astonishingly is 205%, female thyroid is 112. And again, that's only a couple of the cancers. About half the ones measured are greater than 80 percentile. So they come from the cancer registry. I have a citation for that. And by the way, this is very personal to me, and I do work in the profession of treating rare disease and cancer as a researcher with technology, so it's pretty close to home. As we discussed during the site walkthrough, attached materials from the PIP process which might be helpful for your organization during the evaluation process. I'm also providing the site map, which is annotated and handed out. Also some photos of locations which were visited, which have been referenced in PIP documentation, e.g. the carbonizer pit, trench, tailrace, etc. I went on to thank you for the concerns of the residents, the Charles River Watershed Association, etc. And I just, again, wanted to reinforce, I've been following the Buckley and Mann development for 28 years, have read every single piece of documentation, talked to DP before I bought my lot, and have spent just thousands of hours down there. I saw the remediation go in. I know what's in the AUL, the cap go on, and things like that. So I guess one of my appeals is how can we get everyone comfortable with it? It's not good for the abutters, it's not good for the residents if the town does put a well in down there to have any concerns. In 2014, there was a planning video that was done, and in that, it was actually 4 years and 3 days ago. It's up on the YouTube site. And in that, the applicant and the town discussed the toxic waste, potential for toxic waste. And the applicant did mention that he had 2 licensed site professionals looking at it under the foundation. These are areas that we have concerns about, and if that information could be shared, it would be helpful. It might be helpful for the town to consider hiring a licensed site professional to do a visual inspection and to not focus on groundwater, but to look at site conditions and surface water. So that was really what I wanted to get the point across on. All the documentation that was provided, including some pictures that taken through the site walkthrough or photos on Flickr of the site as it was demolished or available out on the internet, as is the Kansas registry. So I'm offering up myself and anyone else on the zoning board to get familiar with it, to help clear the air, and that's really what I want to go through today.
Thank you. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to return to look at the landscape and architects' presentations. Thank you. Are you ready?
I was expecting some more this time. It's too much.
Thank you, everyone. Matt Marva is going to present an updated landscape plan for the applicant. Matt, you ready?
Yes, I am. Thanks. Matt Merva with Bowler Engineering. We're going to run through some of the landscape architectural modifications and also discuss the slopes a little bit. And Rick Goodrow will be joining me up here as well as we run through those items. But just wanted to give everyone kind of a brief overview. Since we were last here, we've reviewed the Beta comment letters and the Horsley-Witten comment letters and have responded in writing to those and wanted to run through some of the changes that we'll be making to the plans relative to those comments. Specifically, just wanted to talk initially about some of those items relating to evergreen screening that was requested as part of the Beta comment letters. Around some of the basins and between some of the garage units and at the buffers of the property. We can get into more detail on those, but we've agreed to add landscape in those locations. We've also modified the street tree plantings to swap out some species that Beta asked us to take a look at. And those are all reflected in this updated plan. Relative to the slopes, I just wanted to, if you could flip to the next slide. Actually, we'll start with the reconfiguration of the rental units that relate to some of the comments architecturally about breaking up the garage units and providing additional parking for the units in this area. So the plan you see reflects that, where rather than having those long garages, we've spread those out into some smaller garage units sprinkled throughout the site and some additional on-street parking and head-in parking off of the main access drives. That really start to break up and distribute that parking kind of more evenly. I think Henry's going to talk a little bit more about the architecture there. Rick, if you just want to chime in on some of the parking numbers.
Yes, so at the request of the applicant, we revised some of the garage spaces as Matt has spoken about, and in so doing, we were also able to add some additional parking to the common area project. So we've actually reduced the garage spaces, which now include 23 garages, and 118 parking spaces are proposed for outside of the building areas, and that turns out to have 141 parking spaces total within the common areas, which is approximately 2.5 spaces per unit. So that's what we have from the comments that we had received with respect to parking within the common areas. As Matt had said, the landscaping has been revised to reflect plantings around those areas.
So this is a view kind of blowing up enlarging the common area and showing some of the screening that we'll be providing to create a little more privacy for some of these units that face out onto the common space. Each would have a patio surrounded by evergreen planting with some additional ornamental trees that help to augment what we were already providing for street trees along here. And then we're providing additional evergreen planting in between the units to create a little more screening and privacy around those. So kind of separating the public space from the private with some additional landscape. We show a cross-section right here that is a section through this unit. So you can see the more private terrace space with a little bit of berming and the trees that line the common, and then the common pathway right here, and then the common itself would be right here. So in some cases, the common space is a little bit lower than the patio area. These patios would have a 4-foot fence around them to create kind of a visual buffer, but not really a true wall to make it feel super enclosed. We just want to create a little privacy for someone sitting down and eating out on their back terrace there. So, as I said, we've augmented the planting in those areas. If you could flip to the next one for me. We also, in response to some comments, I think we provided a little more detailed planting around the circle at the main entry drive. And this will be reflected in the final set of plans that we show, but we've layered up that central area rather than just being lawn. We've got some shade trees and some low ground cover planting and some shrub planting in the center of that island, but leaving the edge low for visibility and for allowing snow to be pushed up on the sides there. To the next one. And Rick's going to talk a little bit about the slopes. This is our main entry here, and there was some discussion in the comment letters about the slope treatments, and we'll get into that more specifically, but Rick's going to talk about some of the numbers relative to that.
So what we had started with when we were preparing the grading for the site was we looked at this area right here, which is reflected up in this picture here. And that slope in that area currently approximates a 2-to-1 slope. So the slope grading of 2-to-1 behind the properties of 51 Lawrence Street heading towards the east were continued with the 2-to-1 slope. In this area here, a retaining wall was added of approximately 6 feet in height. The roadway in that area is approximately elevation 218, goes to a high point in here of approximately 256, and then drops down in the rear yard of the 51 Lawrence Street property to approximately an elevation of 50. The site grading will start approximately 4 feet off that lot line and go down at the 2-to-1 slope as we had discussed. Matt will talk in greater detail about the stabilization of the slopes as well as the landscape plantings proposed in that area. One of the reasons we had looked at the 2-to-1 slope as it came around this area here was to be able to preserve this existing area of vegetation that's shown in green to help buffer the project from the other houses located along Old Lawrence Street and in this area here. And additional plantings were proposed at the slope areas about mid-slope to provide for some additional screening. Evergreens were added up around the edge, and again, Matt will talk about that in greater detail. So you can see that the cross-section was done here, showing the existing 51 Lawrence Street house, how the property is sloping up towards the property line, and the slope will come down. That cut was done at the retaining wall approximately in the corner here. And then you can see what the site would have for a house plantings and what the visibility lines for the 51 Lawrence Street house would be. So the 51 Lawrence Street house, I believe, is approximately 185 feet from the house to the nearest structure. It was measured to these two structures. It was approximately 185, 190 feet to both of those structures, just to give you an idea of the spacing from the proposed structures to the existing structures. And again, I think Matt can talk in more detail about the plantings that are proposed along the boundary line, as well as the mid-slope and the slope stabilization planting. Thank you.
So as Rick mentioned, on that 2-to-1 slope, we would be proposing evergreen buffering up along the property line. So you can see that in cross-section right here. That would be a mix of evergreen trees, and those will be on the final plans that we pulled together, but at time of planting, they'd be about 7 to 8 feet tall. And then as you travel down the slope, we'd have an intermediate layer of shrub plantings, native material, and then the slope itself would be treated with a conservation mix seed, which would include rye and fescue that would establish quickly, but then a wildflower mix that over time would grow up to be a more aesthetic treatment to that slope. But that would not be a mowed condition. That would be left to go wild and return to a forested condition over time. But those layers of planting will help to establish that immediately and prevent erosion. The soil would be tackified, as mentioned in the Horsley-Witten letter. It'll be hydroseeded with an emulsifier that would create the erosion control for that slope. And we've agreed to treat it that way per the recommendation, rather than have a fiber mat or something that is a little more difficult to get grass to establish up through. So that's the plan for the landscape treatment along this edge. We have several areas where we're providing those evergreen trees at the border of where we meet the existing vegetation that you see in the section here. And then further down the slope, that intermediate layer of lower growing material, but the entire slope being treated with the conservation seed mix. The images that Rick mentioned, this picture is taken from right here where we're just tying into existing grade essentially, so that already is a 2-to-1 slope, just to give you a sense of what that slope looks like. And I've passed that image out to the board as well. And then the image to the right of that shows what that seed mix starts to look like right after establishment. So it's meant to not be mowed like you see in the treatment down here. It's left to grow and just return to a natural state there. So that's for everything in the kind of mint green area you see through here.
Matt?
Yes.
51. What's the elevation of the house at 51? In this picture, it appears as if it's level. Doesn't it drop back? Unit 51.
It does. So if you actually look at the cross-section to the top of the page, you can see that from the house, it actually goes up slightly in elevation to the property line from the 51 house.
This is existing grade right here, so it's really right at the crown where water's already flown back in this direction on the surface.
And will undermining the trees that are there now and that exist, will that affect erosion on the 51 side? Where you could have the new plantings on the 2-to-1 slope, once you take out the existing vegetation, will that affect the established trees on the 51's property?
You know, our limit of work would be right here. So we're not changing any of the slope or tree cover that's in this area. We're not causing any more water to come onto the site. The flow of surface water would be away from that property. Right, that watershed line is really almost right at the property line.
Mind flipping to the next slide?
Next one, please. I'm sorry. Wanted to get to the photometric plans. Great. So one of the requests was to provide a more detailed photometric plan for the property based on the light locations that we've been showing, which we've done. We had to enlarge it actually, so we have a few different sheets subsequent to this, if you could flip to the next one, that start to show the light levels in all of those locations. So you can see, here's an example of where we're proposing a light pole, and that outer line is where we're at 0.2 foot candles, and then the small numbers here, which when you blow it up are easy to see, take it all the way out to 0, which is really just beyond that area. So this was the plan we were asked to prepare, and there is a sheet that covers each section of the. That's great. Nope, that's fine. If you wouldn't mind going back to the very first plan for me. Just also wanted to mention some of the augmented planting we're doing in this area. We're proposing this as a reforested area where, if you look in the detail of what we're showing here, shows a mix of varieties of shade trees and lower growing vegetation that would be planted in this area to reestablish the tree cover in this central feature. So that'll become more of a wooded area over time. We've also provided detail on the seed mix we're proposing. We welcome suggestions if there's something different that we'd like to see, but this does have a good amount of the rye and fescue that is going to help get those slopes established quickly. This is the slope stabilization mix that we discussed. With that, I can turn it over to questions, or we can move on to the architectural piece.
Questions from the board? Bill, do you?
My question is, I thought we had talked last time that we were going to look at plantings in front of that driveway, the entrance to the site on the western side, where it looks like, I don't know what the vegetation is on the other side of Lawrence Street, but just my concern is that the headlights kind of swinging past those properties.
Right. We that was in the beta letter as well, to locate the driveway and the house that's on this side of the road, and we did agree to show that on the next round of plans. We just have not incorporated that yet, but we will have it in there.
Okay.
Matt, at the last hearing, we discussed having a three-dimensional perspective drawing of that landscape common area, that field. I had raised a question about the slope of that field. It's kind of hard to visualize how steep that is. You guys were trying to assure me that it was going to be fairly flat, but we'd asked for a three-dimensional view of that. Have you provided that?
We don't have that yet. This is a 5% slope down this area here. We've been trying to wait until some of the architectural features settle down around this area. Yes. Oh, good. Okay.
It's going to be part of the architect's presentation.
Oh, I'm sorry. That is going to be part of the architect's presentation. The perspective that Mr. Hill just asked about.
Bill, do you have any comments on the landscape at this time?
Well, I'm going to ask Scott Ritter, who's our landscape architect that did the review, just to touch on a couple of highlights that were in our letter.
Thank you. We did take a look at all the plant material and the plans that Matt had prepared, so we had some general comments on some of the species, which they've addressed, tree spacing, which we have addressed with them as well. So it's kind of the general overall concept of the planting, we certainly feel is adequate for the development. There are a couple areas that, I guess we need to kind of take a little bit further look at. One is that slope along Lawrence Street. It is 2-to-1 shown on the plan, but I think your regulations state that it needs to be 3-to-1 if it's for a certain height and then benched. So, a waiver may be needed for that. Some ways to maybe get around that are to include a low retaining wall on the bottom of the slope nearer some of the newer houses. And then that, if you can raise that grade up, then you might be able to flatten the slope. You might not be able to get to 3-to-1 just because of the available distance, but you might be able to flatten that, which may help erosion in the long run. Although there are ideas of putting the tackifier and some of the native trees and shrubs is an excellent idea, because that certainly will help hold the slope during the initial growth of the plant material. So we like that idea. And one of the other things that Matt just mentioned that I thought was really good, that they're trying to save some additional existing trees along that edge. So that's kind of where the cut and balance comes into effect. If we keep with the 2-to-1, we can save more existing trees, which is a benefit. But if you go 3-to-1, you may have a better chance of holding that slope. So I think your case can be made for either one on that. As far as the slope of the common, when I looked at it a couple of weeks ago after our meeting, I came up with about 7%. So it's a little steeper than the 5, unless I misread the contours or if something's changed. So that's basically 7 feet over 100 feet. So it's not awfully steep, but it's steeper than your typical walk. But I think with the architecture stepping down the hill, I don't think you really notice that. They did add some plant material and screening around the detention basins and at the backs of some of the units, which I think is really good. They've got this great tree corridor between the backs of some of the houses, like right in the middle of the development, which is great for wildlife and pollinators and things like that. So I think that's a real benefit to the community as well. Let's see. Someone made a comment at the last meeting about topsoil leaving the site, and the town does have a regulation saying that it can't do that. So we suggested to the applicant that they waste some of that material on site in some of the areas near some of the clearing, or if they had possibility to use it near the near the boathouse, that open area there, and the applicants agreed to do that as well. So there won't be loam or topsoil leaving the site. One of the other areas in that same location is the treatment plant. Tonight we found out that there's a 40 by 50 foot building in that area, so we don't have landscape plans for that area yet. I don't think the site's been designed fully for the treatment plant, but screening certainly needs to happen there, whether it's walls or fences or a combination of planting, because some of those residences are very close to that facility. So I want to make sure that that is adequately screened as well. And then the area of the commons, they took out the large garage, which I'm sure they'll talk about more, but the concept plan so far doesn't have the landscaping on it, but I'm assuming that it's going to be in the same quality and quantities that the other areas of the site are. So we'll certainly need to take a look at that when that is finally done as well. And then the cross-section that Matt showed of the green common area, I think is really good, that they've got the private patios in the back. Those are screened, and then there's a nice little berm with a tree, and then the walkway. So I think that's going to be a really nice face on that side. I think if you're in the common, you'll see the houses, but you won't be able to see some of the private outdoor areas in the back. I think that's a very good feature there as well. I think that's generally it. If you have any other questions, be happy to help answer those as well.
Anybody from the board have any questions?
The only thing I would add, Mr. Chairman, is we also, took a look at the photometric plan, the street lighting. And again, the idea of the street lighting was not to provide a uniform level of light for all the roadways, but rather to light the critical areas, the intersections, of roadways. So I think we've been able to confirm that they are using cutoff fixtures, which are required. The lighting seems to be serving its purpose, and it's not spilling back to those houses that are nearest to the lighting. When you get back to those houses, it's pretty much gone back to zero. And the other piece, which isn't as critical on a big site like this, but there's no lighting that's spilling off the site onto any abutting properties. So I think we're satisfied at this point with the lighting layout.
Tom, are you going to have your architect?
Good evening, folks. I'm Henry Arnaudo from HPA Design. We are presenting tonight a supplement to what was talked about at the last meeting and the discussion. And along with the discussions we had at the beta group and the peer review architect, Glenn Finocchio, I'm sorry, I apologize. Can you give the right slide, please? Can you pass out the hard copy? After the last meeting, our task was basically to come up with a streetscape view of the rental properties, and we're showing a sample of 3 different types of units. And as was discussed earlier, the garages got broken up and separated and distributed along the 2 ring roads. So we have, along one of the ring roads, this is our typical streetscape view. We have the ranch-style duplex. We have a 2-car garage. We have a townhouse duplex. And then we have a townhouse duplex with a master bedroom on the first floor. And this is what the rental units will look like, covering the 3 models that we have. Along with that, we are asked to take a look at, and I think, Mr. Hill, I think this is to your point, as to the slope of the courtyard. And this is at the high side. We have a 4-car garage. We've broken the mass of the 4-car garage into a 12-foot mass, 24-foot mass, and another 12-foot mass. Again, trying to keep in the spirit of something that is diminutive in scale and appropriate with the neighborhood. And then we have the back elevation of the townhouse, the back elevation of the larger townhouse with a master bedroom on the first floor, and the rear elevation of a 2-car garage. And I think, Matt, maybe you can speak to this, but I think from this point heading towards the pavilion, we're probably looking at about a 6-foot drop. Is that correct, Matt? So these elevations here start here, heading downhill to there, which is that.
Yeah, it's probably 6 to 8 feet.
Okay.
I'd say.
Okay. So what we did as the site steps is we stepped the units down to meet the grade. And, you know, Matt has a supplement to the hardscape fencing and the berming and the landscape that happens 12 or 14 feet in front of this unit. We took our elevation head on with the berm and the planting behind us, just to give you an idea of what the architecture is doing. So there's a marriage between what we're proposing and what Matt's proposing, and that's a way of trying to tell you what this will look like as we come through this roundabout here and look towards the pavilion.
You're saying that's only a 6-foot drop?
I guess Matt's saying it's 8 feet.
I mean, I'm looking at your grading plan.
So are these 2-foot intervals?
It goes from a 204 to 220, doesn't it?
So it starts high here, right? So, yeah.
So, question is from here, we've got a 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16-foot drop in the elevation. So
But not at buildings.
that's correct.
not
So the
like-
grade's picking up, that's at the walkway. So the grade's picking up at the building. So what's being shown is what's happening to the building. So there's about a 6-foot elevation change from the walkway in that area up to the building. So I think that's creating some of the confusion.
What's the actual slope, though, over that 16 feet? On the common?
But on the common, it's about 5 to 6%, if I remember correctly. I don't know it off the top of my head, but I believe the contours were spaced for approximately 5 to 6%.
Is that it?
Actually, that contour plan that's there now, actually Henry had actually picked that up from a previous topography on that. Rick actually provided the elevations that's on the cross-section that you looked at, Mr. Hill, that's going through there, that would be grading to. That grading over the open area there will be revised as we go through some of the final grading designs with that. So it will match what you see on the cross-sections, but it's not exactly reflected here on this.
I think we use this as a key plan, not necessarily indicative of what the contours are doing. But nonetheless, what happens along the face of the rear of the buildings is different than what happens 25 feet away from it. So it's hard to depict that unless we keep taking slices every 5 or 10 feet.
My comment from the last meeting was more to the field, which I thought could be a very nice, usable space for the residents. And my comment was simply that how usable will it be if it's steep? And it's hard for me to visualize how steep this is just by looking at contours on the map. So, you know, and this is a question for our experts, our architectural peer reviewer, our landscape peer reviewer. You know, it would be nice for you guys to maybe to consider terracing that, so you have some flat spaces that people can use as flat picnic areas or fields to kick a ball around and things like that. If it's steep, it's not that usable. That was my only comment on that issue.
I'll defer that to Matt. I think Matt, being a landscape architect and a peer review landscape architect, maybe come to a better solution than what I would.
Where's Glenn say? Yeah, can we ask Glenn?
We could certainly look at placing some flatter areas and then some maybe steeper areas within that area. However, we do have the discharge area for the wastewater treatment plant in there, so we do have some cover issues that have to be considered with respect to that as well. So the idea was to have a uniform stepping of those trenches along that area and a uniform grade over the top of it. But there is the ability to have some grade changes built into that.
Glenn, do you have a comment on that, or?
In terms of the slope that's being described, I guess to put it into context for you, a handicap ramp is 8%. So we're shallower than a handicap ramp, but a little bit steeper than what would be a standard sidewalk. Just to give you kind of a visual as to what the slope of this is. If you're playing kickball, it's going to roll easier one direction than the other, obviously, but it's not a really steep slope.
Just for some perspective, how wide do you think this building is? Not tall, but...
No, I'm counting silly things. So this is 60 feet wide.
60 feet this way, what about this way? I'm just trying to, if it's about 100 feet, more or less, wide this way.
So this is a little more than 100 this way.
So if that doorway is roughly 7 feet high, if you took from the top of that doorway down to the floor on that end of the building, just you can imagine that's about the slope we're talking about, maybe even a little bit flatter than that.
That's going from 7 feet to 0. This is 16-foot drop, isn't it?
Yeah, but over a longer distance.
Oh, okay. I got it.
Yeah, so as he said, 7% is 7 feet over 100.
Len, while you're up there, do you want to talk about the rental units? I know you had some comments on
Well,
the back of them and also on the garages.
Basically, the applicant has done what we discussed at the work session, which is they've broken up the large barn-like parking structures, and now this feels a lot more like the ownership part of the community, just denser. So, I mean, this is kind of like the middle of the village, and then things kind of spread out. So I think this is an effective way of addressing it. The only question I have for the applicant is we were concerned about the parking numbers. So maybe if somebody could talk to, relative to the number of units, now how many parking spaces are provided, how many garage spaces are provided, and how many shared or visitor spaces are provided. That was something that we were concerned about before.
Actually, to go over that, we have 23 garage spaces proposed, 118 parking spaces proposed outside, and that would account for 141 total parking spaces within that area. So there's 56 units, and that would equate to about 2.52 parking spaces per unit. Yeah, there are some guest spaces around the garages. Amy, if you could go to, it's not in Henry, it's going to be in Matt's. Matt, do you know which? Yes. So you can see where we have the fanned out parking spaces.
Rich, do you want to use a pointer?
So we have some visitor parking here, and over in this area here, as well as some parking spaces here for visitors. So I believe there's 6 spaces here, 6 more here, 12, 18, 21 spaces that are basically not part of the front parking of the buildings or the garage spaces themselves.
You've got about 21 guests, 23 spaces with garages, then the remainder are parking spaces at the units.
Correct.
There's 23 garage spaces. There's 118 total spaces. If you equate 1 space for each unit outside with that and take 118 minus the 56, then you're essentially left with 62 common spaces around the site. And that in front of those buildings, they're basically like a 3-car wide parking space. So 1 would be dedicated for each one, and then you could have the overlap, 1 in the middle, and then there's different common area parking spaces around, as Rick pointed out.
Thank you. Anything else with architecture? All set? Okay. Any questions from the board for the architecture or landscape again? All right, we'll open it up to the public. Anybody with any questions with regard to architecture or landscape?
This is Karen McCabe, Lawrence Street. I was wondering is there any, like, trash facilities for this? Is there going to be dumpsters or personal trash, and where will these trash cans be?
It'd be basically, since it is a rental complex, it'd be a site contractor that would pick up basically recyclables and the trash disposal bins like you'd see in any type of condominium project, and they'd be stored on the side of the house or something outside with that.
With the rentals, what will the rentals have? Same thing?
Yes, exactly. That's what I thought we were talking about, was the rentals. The home ownership would have them. You'd store them in your garage. Here, you could store them if you rented a garage in that, or you would actually keep it to the outside on the side of your house, out of the way. We'd actually have a dedicated area for that. So basically, each rental unit would have their own trash container.
Chris Wagner, Park Street. Just with regards to the landscaping, I know you guys didn't necessarily get to read all the comments for the E&F. One of them was from the Charles River Watershed, and they recommended tree replacement of 1-to-1. I know we talked about planting something in the order of 300 or so plantings for this, but there hasn't been any talk about, I think probably around 50 acres of this would be cleared native forest. I know it's just a recommendation by Charles River Watershed, but what kind of replacement of current vegetation would there be for the existing trees? And then the other piece, on the other slide with the cross-section, it showed the existing slope. And I know on like one corner of the property, there's a 2-to-1 slope that's existing, and that we're doing a 2-to-1 slope to try to maintain some of the vegetation. That's kind of assuming that if we were to make it a flatter slope, we would extend towards the abutters, as opposed to if we raise up the site a bit, you're obviously going to have less of a slope. So I don't know if there's any consideration for that. We saw the existing elevations, and it wasn't exactly a really steep hill. It was pretty rolling. It seems like something you could probably build on without excavating that whole area.
Matt, do you want to address those?
So in terms of the replacement, you're right, we're in the 350 street tree range. That doesn't include all of the proposed evergreens that we're providing for buffering. That was just the street trees. And then we've also included a reforestation area. If you could flip back to that first slide again. In this zone here, which we've not quantified how many trees are going to be in that area yet, but I don't think we're approaching a 1-to-1 replacement, even with all of that planting, but it is a significant amount of trees for a project of this size, and not to mention all of the existing vegetation that's going to remain in the trail network that's at the perimeter of the site and into the rest of the untouched area.
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking if we could have some kind of estimate as to what's going to be felled from this property. And then I know the recommendation was obviously not to be able to replace all the trees on site with buildings and roads and whatnot, but it would be to replace off-site too, if possible.
Yeah, that's not been discussed as of yet. I hadn't seen that recommendation personally, but we'd have to review it with our client. I just think that's going to be a difficult replacement on site for sure, just given the nature of how condensed the development is to preserve the rest of that open space. There just isn't the room to do it. I understand your point. I'm just not sure that we can do it. I'm sorry, what was the other part of your question?
I think it's on the next slide where you have the cross-section for like 51 Lawrence Street,
yeah.
And the existing grade. It really kind of shows like how much actual earth is being removed, whereas that doesn't look like it's something that's necessarily an impediment to building. Is your question
does the road need to be at this elevation? I think we've looked at several different grading studies and actually brought the roads up in a lot of cases. I'm not sure about this particular location, but we have looked at different grading treatments for it. But this is really what's working best for the circulation on site. And we've tried to provide mitigation in the form of planting and slope treatment and retaining walls to minimize the impact of those slopes.
Yeah, and I guess, if you're working with the current layout, you're constrained. So I guess obviously the other option would be for fewer homes to be able to work more with the topography. Even if the road's at that elevation, I don't know if there's any requirements as far as the driveway slope and that type of thing, but just, I know the grading's a big concern, so particularly for 51 Lawrence Street, where we can see it's a pretty gradual slope off the back of the property, and now they're going to deal with a 2-to-1 slope. Is there any way to mitigate that?
Tom, are you still working with the owner of 51 with regard to their... Is the owner of 51 Lawrence Street here?
She did not yet tonight.
Okay. Any other questions?
I just want to know, where are the other parking spaces for where the houses are? Remember, there used to be little sections, and I don't know if I just missed it on the big picture, but you showed
Kind of the
nice-
guest parking up in the
Right,
other
where the
part.
regular houses
Those
are.
haven't gone away. They're still there.
Okay.
Do you mind flipping back to
Because I
the
just
overall
didn't see
site
them.
plan?
Where?
Can you zoom in at all on this area? Just so I can point some things out. Yeah, that's great. So we still have some here. It's tough to see at this scale, but these are all proposed guest parking spaces.
And how many are there for the houses area?
We're in the houses area
No,
now.
no, but I mean, how many altogether, extra?
Oh, total. Do you know, Rick, off the top of your head? We can get that count for you. I don't have that number handy. Yeah, there are several locations for them throughout the neighborhood.
Okay, I was just wondering if they were still there.
Yep.
We'll get that information for you, how many there are in total.
Peg Bedard,
We'll get
28
you how many there are in total, so you know.
Peg Bedard, 28 Lawrence Street. I'm trying to find out, is it 141 total parking spots, or is it 141 plus 21 parking spots? I'm very confused by that.
For the common area, right?
For the common area. I did not get a clear answer on that.
There's 141 parking spots allocated to the commons.
That's it?
Twen-
The 21 what is-
23 garage spaces separate from the structures, 21 guest parking spots along the commons, and then the balance are the driveways of the common apartments.
So it's 141 total?
141, you're correct.
Okay. And is there street parking involved? Did I understand that as well? Is part of this being counted from street parking, or is that a separate thing? Is part of this including street parking, or is that something separate?
Not that I'm aware of, Rich.
No, that 141 is garage spaces, parking spaces either in front of the buildings or in the designated parking areas, not including any on-street parking.
How many parking spaces are for the actual units? Like, for that unit? How long is the driveway?
The driveways are a minimum of 20 feet.
So should that allow for 2 cars in the driveway for the common areas?
I'm sorry, for the common areas?
Yeah, I was asking about the common areas.
Oh, the
I'm not
common
asking-
area? Yes.
So
It
it's a
should-
20-foot driveway for the common area units? That's what you're
They're
saying?
20 feet deep, front to back, to allow for a car to park in them.
So that would be 2 cars or 1 car?
One car.
Okay. So the other question I also have has to do more with toys and carriages and things like that. Where is that?
So each one of those buildings has basically the ability to have 4 parking spaces in front of it, 2 for each unit. And then there's the additional parking spaces by the garages and then the garage spaces themselves.
So wait, now you're saying they have, each unit has 2 parking spaces?
Correct.
Okay.
You asked how deep the parking spaces were. They're 20 feet front to back.
Okay.
And they're also 9 feet wide.
9 feet wide, so,
So for instance, that unit right there could accommodate 4 parking spaces in front of that unit.
so every place will have 4 parking spaces
Some
in
of
front of
them
it?
have 3. That one has 3. The majority of them, 4, 4, 4, 4. There was 4 there, 4, 4, 4, 4, 3, 4.
Okay. So then the other thing is, where is storage for things like toys? You know, kids have like big toys, carriages, bicycles, things like that. Where is storage for that?
These are the ones for the commons, Peg, or for the preserve, or both?
For the commons.
For the commons. So she's talking with regard to the apartments.
They could either rent a garage, or they'd be back storage on their patio, or anything behind the house where they'd have privacy.
So the anticipation is to keep this stuff out, for
If
people to
they-
keep this stuff out.
If there's bikes or things like that that are outside types of toys, yes.
Personally, I think that's unsightly. I think that's something to really be considered. I don't know how that can be accommodated, but I think there should be some accommodation, because every person, well, I'm sure you've had young children. I'm sure you've had those little toys, those little runabout things they have. We've all had kids grow up, they have bikes. This is supposed to be a community of that type of nature. There should be accommodations for things like that. I don't think we should look at people's toys, trash, carriages, cars. I mean, and plus the wear and tear on those things. I think there should be some accommodation for that.
Tom, can you look at that a little bit? I don't know, Glenn, can you also provide some input to? And I think this is the commons, and I can appreciate her comment. We don't want to, people don't want to see toys out there.
These are the rental units
Rental
that you're
units.
discussing.
Yes.
So, one, I mean, yeah, having grown up with a couple of siblings myself, the inside of the house is not a pristine catalog. Our toys were in the house. We did have a single-car garage, so bicycles went in the garage. There are garages if you choose to rent a garage.
Glenn, can you speak close to the mic? They can't hear you in the
Sure.
back.
But rental units in general do not have garages. I think the fact that there's the ability, if someone chooses to rent a garage, is a great benefit. I don't think that it is reasonable for us to be mandating, and I don't believe that your town ordinance anywhere does mandate, that every rental unit must have a garage. So while I understand the comment about toys, I think being realistic about what is appropriate for us to be telling a developer they need to provide, that there are limits.
I do believe this is supposed to fall within the guidelines of it matches the community. That's what the heart of this is. And I don't think that matches the heart of Norfolk. I don't think you drive down the streets of Norfolk and see bikes, carriages, toys sitting out in the street. And I think it changes the character of the community. That's the heart of this.
What about the trash containers, recycling containers?
Well,
Where were
trash
those?
containers, I mean, again, it's very common. Again, I live in Providence, which is obviously a denser area than this, and we all have those big rollout because nobody actually picks up a trash can anymore. The big machine comes and lifts it and dumps it in. We have little fenced pens that they're in. So on the side of these buildings, there could easily be fenced pens that would enclose the trash can and recycle bins.
That was going to be my point. So couldn't Tom add a feature to these buildings?
Easily.
Of a fenced-in area which could accommodate the trash cans? Because unless you have somewhere else you're putting the trash cans, they're going to be visible, which is not great. So maybe you could have a fenced-in area in the back of the buildings or in the side of the buildings that could contain the trash cans as well as the bikes and ride-ons and things like that that might be unsightly. Is that...
I guess the only thing I'm not sure about is how much space that would start to take up. A trash can and a recycle bin is probably 2.5 by 4 or 5 feet. I guess the question is, how do you determine how much space you need for bicycles and toys? And I know my neighbors that have kids, if you look in their backyard, it looks like a Toys R Us exploded.
I think the comment, though, is that these really are two-family houses. I mean, they're not apartment buildings. And so I think the board appreciates the comments that this is meant to look like a residential area. And I think the comments are well taken, that there should be some kind of screening of those kind of things.
I think the other thing you might want to consider is it could be a safety issue. You're saying at points that there might be elderly people that want to rent these units. People trip over things. I don't think you should set people up for tripping over things.
Then with a little dormer type of structure off the backs, maybe, 4-foot-high dormer with doors on it or something, that you could put your trash can in and toys in. Would that be feasible, maybe? I don't know, Tommy or Glenn?
Well, again, now you start getting into, if now we're talking about a very small enclosure, I'd suggest that you want it to be open air and ventilated, because in the summer, having a trash can in a small enclosure, that's not such a great thing either. But definitely screening, fencing is a good idea. Again, I don't want to speak for the architect. Maybe there's the ability to have little lean-to sheds or freestanding sheds that accommodate some of the other objects that people have in their yards. Because, of course, it's not just necessarily little kids' toys. Adults have toys, too. We have bicycles and kayaks and all kinds of fun stuff. So maybe there's a way of having an in-between. If you're not going to rent a whole garage, maybe there are smaller, a 5 by 10 foot storage shed.
Thank you, Glenn. Tommy, you think you can maybe try to think about that a little bit?
We will take a look and see if there's something we can do. And I do want to, reinforce what Glenn said. These are rental units, and we were asked to try to make them look more like a house and a residential house instead of, 3-story, 4-story rental types of units with things that really doesn't fit into the character in Norfolk. So, we'll try our best here with things, but maybe it seems like everybody's pushing that maybe rental isn't a good thing. Maybe they should just be all for-sale houses. And we could look at that, and that gives us, the garages, the abilities, and the storage, and everything else.
That makes sense.
That's something that maybe the board might want to look at.
It's something to consider. Thank you. That's something I would like to hear. The other question I still have is about my neighbor, Patrick and Dorothea's house, 51 Lawrence Street. I want to know what the grade, they're not here, so I want to know what the grade of the slope is, and I want to know the depth of the slope.
I think your neighbor at 51
They live
either
across the
has
street
to
from me.
address, come to the board. I think the applicant has tried to contact her. For some reason, she doesn't want to speak to him. I think they've got to discuss that. I think they've discussed the grade of 51 up here. I think if the owner of 51 has concerns, I think it has to be worked out as it was reported by Horsley Witten with the applicant. I don't think it's appropriate for you to be speaking for her, and I don't think it's appropriate for Tom to address it to you. It should be addressed to the owner of that property. She has owner property rights, and I think they should be addressing it.
I just want to ask the depth and the grade. That's all I want to ask. It's public information.
Rich, would
That's
you
all I'm
please
asking.
give her the depth and grade again of that slope on 51?
The slope is a 2-to-1 slope. I'm not sure.
So how many feet out does, how many feet from their property line does, how many feet?
Let Rick finish, please.
I know.
Please, Rich.
So what that basically means is for every 2 feet we go out, we go up 1 foot. So that's what the 2-to-1 is. 2 feet out, 1 foot up. Continues up the slope. We said we had an elevation in the road of approximately 218 to 250 at her property. Obviously, the road sloping, the land sloping. That's in the area where we had provided you the cross-section. That's 32 feet. 32 times 2 is 64 feet, so that slope is approximately 64 feet long in that area. It varies. I mean, tell me exactly where you want it, and we could scale it off and tell you what it is, because it varies. The slopes are up and down, the roads are dropping, the elevation at the lines of the back of the area of, work are going to vary. But at that particular location, behind 51, we have the retaining wall at the street. We're going out approximately 32 feet, and 64 feet total, 32 feet in height.
How far off the property line are you going to start the?
As we said, it's about 4 feet off the property line.
Okay.
So that's what I was asking. That's what I wanted to know.
Okay.
Okay. And then the other thing I also wanted to say was, you brought up precedents, Attorney Hill. Are you prepared to set the precedence of removing 1 million cubic yards? Because that's precedence for the entire state of Massachusetts. That hasn't come close anywhere in Massachusetts. So that's that's something you really should seriously consider, because that impacts not just this development, but every development going forward in the state of Massachusetts.
Are you going to answer or no answer? Oh, okay, I wasn't sure. Karen McCabe, I appreciate Devin's comments on the actual neighbors. Not everything's been discussed on inside. This is doubling or tripling, I forget all the extra traffic. But there's only been one street discussed here, and there's another street which all of the development, like all the traffic of all the work vehicles is going out. And I would assume, even when there is fully developed, just regular car traffic, there's houses that are there that are going to get turns, and there's especially two houses, it's 14 and 16 Lawrence Street, and nothing's been discussed how you're going to buffer lights going into their house. I'd especially think 14, and the furthest from an expert, maybe Devin would understand better, when they're coming out of that street, and it's even in the traffic plans, all those trucks will be going by at least one house, which is 14 Lawrence. How is that house being protected? They have not, I saw them here earlier, I don't see them here now, but just overall, the residents there need to, on the other side of the street, both on the two entries into this development, need to be thought of. And I haven't heard any discussion on those.
Matt, do you want to address that?
As we mentioned earlier, that was a comment in the beta letter, and we are looking at locating those homes across the street on some kind of concept plan that we would come back with. We don't have that with us tonight.
Karen, you have to come to the mic.
Can you pull up the
There's
overall plan
two streets,
again?
I don't know the name of the streets, but the two streets, I know you referenced before the one that goes into the common area, but there's two streets that come off of Lawrence Street. So the big nasty one that's like, yes.
Can you get us that information? Why don't you get that information?
Right there. I mean,
Which
they
two?
don't put the name of the streets on the plans because there's too many houses, but there's two streets. And he addressed the first street, which is the one on the left, but he didn't address the street on the right. That street, yeah.
Right here.
Correct. There's a house right there in that corner, I think it's 14. That's 16, and the other one's 14. That left-hand turn coming out of that street, and even a right-hand turn to 16, which you pointed, those two houses.
Is your
Gotcha.
Is your concern about headlight glare? Is that what you said?
I would, yeah, because especially 16 Lawrence, I actually stood there the other day, their living room, and they have almost every house in Norfolk have a big bay window. You might be getting a headlight straight into your bay window.
So in order to screen that, wouldn't we have to have screening on their property?
I'm not sure. I would
I
ask
would.
the expert.
You would have to have screening on their property. We haven't spoken with them personally. I haven't heard that concern from them. But it would need to be on their property in order
So
for...
they
should
should
reach
bring
out
the
to us.
concern.
They should reach out to the zoning board and propose or
If
express
they're
that
interested.
concern, and then we can talk to them about potential conditions.
Yeah, maybe, I wouldn't have known that's what to do, so thank you.
I didn't get an answer on the concern about the sinkhole. What is the possibility of, if this develops like it is, that 51 Lawrence Street would be at risk for a sinkhole?
I don't have an answer for you.
That's probably a very genuine concern, a very genuine
I
concern.
think we asked Rich earlier.
I think it was-
We asked Matt earlier to discuss the erosion that might occur at 51. I think we got an answer to that.
I think I asked this earlier, and you told me you would allow me to re-ask it now, is what I think happened. That's what I believe happened
No,
earlier.
Rich, would you please again, or Matt, I think it was Matt. We had spoken briefly about 51. I guess our concern is that sinkholes are created on the property of 51 due to the slope.
Yeah, I'm not sure how a sinkhole would be created by cutting that at a 2-to-1 slope. I mean, that's a normal procedure. I'm not a geologist. I don't know the geology up there on that slope, but a 2-to-1 slope is a standard construction slope that should be able to withstand and stabilize and maintain.
That's why I asked the question earlier, because we were talking about geology earlier. That's why I actually asked the question earlier. And you
Bill?
said it would be discussed now. So I guess I'm a little confused.
Bill, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, Matt's correct. I mean, a 2-to-1 slope is something that's standard in construction. I would say, and again, I'm not a geologist either, but I've certainly done enough construction. I would say the possibility of a sinkhole is unlikely as long as the slope is stabilized the way they've talked about it. The possibility is really erosion along the slope. So as long as that slope is stabilized, they presented methodologies for doing that, both in the short term and the long term. So I think that's the most important thing, is stabilizing the slope so you don't have erosion. I think they've also shown that the runoff is running away from the slope, so that we're not going to have a lot of runoff flowing over the slope. It would tend to create erosion as well.
That seems strange. And the only reason I'm asking that as well is because the other maps, the ones explaining how the water flows, the water seems to flow away from 51 Lawrence Street. It seems to have flowed towards the river and the Tailrace.
I can speak to that a little bit. If you look at the cross section right here, this shows existing grade. So you can see the property line is right at a high point. So basically everything to this side, generally speaking, flows away from the property line to the south, and everything on this side of the property line essentially flows to the north.
So they
I
go in
think
two different
that's where-
directions?
Yeah, it's from this high point. That's kind of a natural ridge line where water goes in two different directions.
And that would have happened even without the interruption?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Any further questions? All right. We've got a few small items to take care of. So do you want to set up a date for the next meeting? We have, I think, Amy, we said March 22nd, March 20th or 22nd? That's a Tuesday or a Thursday. I think it would be good to have the hydrologist here. Yeah. Just there was a few open issues, just to finish those up. Also the landscaping. just some of the small issues with that. It's the only day Dan can't make.
I'm not available that day.
Is that going to be enough time, though, for Rick to get the revised drainage plan done? And then we need to peer review that, so. Yeah? Okay. The other thing that we discussed amongst ourselves after Neil's presentation is it possible for Carlos to give us a narrative with what the proposed specs will be on the treatment plant? We're not asking for a design of the plant, but more of a narrative of the technology that's being proposed for the treatment, the levels of treatment that are being proposed. It seems like something that probably wouldn't take too long to do, since you already gave us a sample permit that you've done. If that's something you can provide, say in the next week or two, we can have somebody at Horsley Witten look at it who's more of a specialist in the treatment plant arena. Is that something you can provide, Tom?
If we're talking about, to what extent would the board want to see like a regrading of this? Are we looking at for a regrading just to establish an overlay with the bedrock to the finished grade? Or are we looking for the entire site to be regraded? The only reason I ask is I think Rick could probably do that in about 2 weeks or 3 weeks, Rick. I want to give your engineer time to review it. That's my point. I don't want to hand it to him the night of the hearing or anything like that. So,
Are you talking about the overlay of the final grading plan in the bedrock?
yeah, is that the only thing that you'd be looking for with that?
On that one issue?
Yeah.
I think that was to respond to Mike Judice's comment about how do we know where you're going to be cutting it.
And that's a pretty easy thing to do with that. So that's, I guess I'm just because I want to make sure we give your peer consultants time to review it and things before hearing.
Yeah, that seemed pretty minor in the grand scheme of things. I mean, I think that's something that should be easily done. And then, of course, the drainage plan is pretty significant. So to get that done and peer reviewed is probably a larger task.
That's what I'm asking. Is that what you would be looking for the 20th to get that done? Because that's pretty significant to get that done and then to get it to Beta to review on those. Time frame wise, what do you think you would need to finish the drainage and final grade plan off of that?
My understanding is we're looking at revising the 3 infiltration basins, getting those over to Beta. So that's going to take a couple of days to regrade the 3 ponds to get those over to Beta.
Okay. I just want to make sure that we provide the board with everything that they need and give ample time for the consultants to review it. So if we're looking for regrading the ponds, the overlay plan, and then the drainage and the overlay, that's what I mean, the detention pond. And then Carlos.
The only question I have, is the technology. You're looking for a description of technology. I'm not sure that I'm quite there. I can be if you need it. I think my thought process is that because of what we're looking at, I want to make sure that what we provide or we propose is the best that we can propose. We're not going to have a second shot. This process is far from being closed. I think if you look at the MEPA process, we've got a ways to go. There's more dialogue to be had. There's more input to be had. And I prefer not to pick the technology at this point.
Yeah, I don't think it was meant to be, we're going to hold you to it. It's more of a, you raised a lot of issues tonight, and I think everyone appreciates your candor. I mean, I think you pointed out that a lot of this stuff is fairly new technology, and I think the board, to have a comfort level, needs to have somebody review this issue and the viability, the feasibility of the technology to kill the viruses and so forth. So,
I can give you, I mean, perhaps I can give you a couple alternatives. If this technology doesn't work, ultimately, I'm looking at treating the same thing. But as you know, there's more than one technology out there for treatment.
So I think it would be helpful for the board to have a narrative, 1 or 2 pages, of something that they can then take to somebody and say, this is what's being proposed. Is this typical? Is this standard? Is this something that works?
You can tell me if it works. Understood.
Okay.
Will do.
I'm going back to March 20th, 22nd, because the follow-up items here, I think, don't need the hydrogeologist from what I'm seeing. If there's something that I've missed, then we need to push it out to the 27th so we can attend. Okay, all right. So I think the 20th or 22nd, whatever, would work for the board better.
Can I have a motion to continue the public hearing till the 22nd of March?
I move to continue the public hearing for the preserve at Abbeville and Abbeville Commons to March 22nd at 7 p.m. at a location to be posted on the town website.
Amy, I think the location would be the middle school, correct? You just have to confirm it? On the 22nd, right?
At the middle school. I'll amend the motion to indicate it's at the middle school.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.
We have a motion to close the public hearing, the zoning board meeting?
I move to close the ZBA meeting of, what's the date? March 1st, 2018 at 11:05 p.m.
Second.
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 All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.